Sold. The word hit Clara Dawson like a fist to the chest, spoken by her own father without flinching, without looking away. She stood on the platform in the full heat of the Arizona sun, her wrists bound with rope, listening to men below call out numbers like she was a horse at market. $20. 30. 50. Her father's eyes never met hers. He was counting the bills before they even changed hands. Before we go further, if this story already has your heart, subscribe to our channel, hit that bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Harold Dawson had made a lot of bad decisions in his 52 years on this earth. He'd lost a cattle herd to a drought he saw coming and did nothing about. He'd lost a house in a card game he should never have sat down at. He'd lost his wife Margaret to a fever that might have been treated if he'd spent less on whiskey and more on a doctor. But standing in the dusty square of Redstone, Arizona territory on a Tuesday morning in September of 1878, Harold Dawson was about to make the worst decision of his life. And the only difference between this one and all the others was that this decision had a face. His daughter's face. Clara had known something was wrong since the night before. Her father had come home from the Silver Spur Saloon later than usual, quieter than usual, and he hadn't looked at her when she set his supper on the table. Harold Dawson was many things: a drunk, a liar, a man who treated his land and his daughter with equal indifference. But he was rarely quiet. Quiet meant he was thinking. And Harold Dawson thinking never led anywhere good. "Papa," she'd said, watching him push beans around his plate. "What happened?" "Nothing." "You haven't eaten." "I said nothing, Clara." She'd gone to bed with that word sitting on her chest like a stone. Nothing. In her experience, when Harold Dawson said nothing, he meant everything, just not anything he was willing to say out loud yet. She found out what it was at 6 o'clock the next morning when he knocked on her bedroom door, told her to put on her good dress, and said they were going into town. "For what?" she asked. "Business," he said. She didn't own many things. A blue dress that had been her mother's let out twice at the seams because Clara had grown taller than Margaret Dawson ever had. A pair of boots with a crack in the left sole, a small silver comb. She put on the dress because she didn't have a reason not to, and because some stubborn part of her believed that whatever was happening, she could face it better if she looked like herself. She would remember later with a bitterness that never fully went away that she had combed her hair that morning, that she had tried to look presentable for the men who were going to buy her. The wagon ride into Redstone took 40 minutes. Harold didn't speak. Clara watched the desert pass red rock and scrub brush and the occasional cactus throwing thin shadows in the early light, and told herself she was being foolish. It was business, like he said. Maybe he'd found a buyer for the south pasture. Maybe one of his debts had been called in and he needed her signature on something. She was 20 years old. She could sign papers. She was still telling herself that story when the wagon pulled into the town square and she saw the platform. It was nothing elaborate. Just rough-cut lumber nailed together, raised about 3 feet off the ground with a set of steps on one side. But there were men gathered around it, 12, 15, maybe more, and an auctioneer standing at the front with a gavel and a ledger, and when the auctioneer saw Harold Dawson's wagon, he raised a hand in greeting like they'd made an appointment, because they had. "Papa." Clara's voice came out very quiet. "What is this?" Harold climbed down from the wagon without answering. He came around to her side and held out his hand to help her down, and for one strange suspended moment, it almost looked like something a father would do. Something decent. "You owe Vic Crane $400, she said. She'd heard the name enough times. Vic Crane owned half the gambling debt in Redstone. "That's what this is about. Clara, tell me I'm wrong." Her voice was shaking now, and she hated it. She pressed her feet flat against the wagon boards and didn't take his hand. "Look me in the eye and tell me you didn't bring me here to—" "460, he said. And something in his voice had gone flat and distant, the way a man's voice goes when he's decided something and doesn't want to hear any more argument about it. "I owe Vic Crane $460, and I don't have it, and he's given me 30 days, and I've had 30 days, and I still don't have it." "I can work," Clara said. "I can take in laundry. I can cook at the hotel. Mrs. Aldridge said she'd. That's not enough, and you know it. Then we sell the land, the south pasture. Already spoken for, against another debt. He still wasn't looking at her. Get down from the wagon, Clara. No. The word came out before she'd decided to say it. It hung in the air between them, small and fierce, and completely useless, because Harold Dawson was her father, and she was 20 years old in the Arizona Territory in 1878. And the law wasn't going to help her, and the town wasn't going to help her, and she knew it even as she said it. He didn't argue. He just reached up, took hold of her arm above the elbow, and pulled her down. She didn't fight him. She wanted to. Every part of her that was still her mother's daughter. The part that had read every book Margaret Dawson left behind, and taught herself mathematics from an old ledger, and learned to argue her own case before she'd learned to cook. That part wanted to fight. But she was 5 feet 4 inches and 120 pounds, and her father's grip was iron, and there were 15 men watching, and she understood with a clarity that felt like swallowing glass that fighting would only make it worse. So she walked. She walked to the platform with her father's hand on her arm, and she climbed the steps, and she stood there in her mother's blue dress, while the auctioneer opened his ledger and cleared his throat. What we have here, the auctioneer said, in the practiced tone of a man who'd sold cattle and horses and farm equipment and apparently daughters, is a young woman of good health and strong constitution, 20 years of age, no encumbrances, able-bodied and capable of domestic work. Someone in the crowd laughed, not a happy laugh. Clara kept her eyes straight ahead. She had decided in the 30 seconds since she'd climbed these steps that she was not going to cry. She was not going to beg. She was not going to give these men the satisfaction of seeing her break. If this was what was happening to her, she would face it on her feet with her chin level because it was the only thing left that was entirely hers. We'll start the bidding at $50, the auctioneer said. A hand went up immediately. Big man, thick beard, the kind of hands that looked like they'd done hard work and hard living in equal measure. Clara didn't look at him directly. She looked at the point just above the crowd's heads, at the dry blue Arizona sky, and breathed. 55, said another voice. 60. 75. The numbers climbed with a horrible casualness, the same tone men used at a livestock auction, considering value calculating use. Clara felt each one like something being taken from her. Not money, but something she didn't have a word for. Some assumption she'd carried about her own life, about her own future being stripped away, bid by bid. She heard her father's breathing beside her. Quick and shallow, the breathing of a man watching his problem solve itself. She thought about her mother. Margaret Dawson had been gentle and fierce in equal measure, a woman who could quote scripture and skin a rabbit with the same calm competence. She had died when Clara was 14, and the thing Clara missed most, more than her voice, more than the smell of her hair, was the way her mother had always looked at her like she was worth something. Not worth a price. Worth something. 100, said a voice from the edge of the crowd. 115. 125. Clara kept her eyes on the sky. She heard him before she saw him. Not because he was loud, in fact. That was the thing that made her look. Everything else had been loud, the bidding, the crowd murmur, the auctioneer's practiced patter, her own heartbeat loud in her ears. The voice that cut through all of it was quiet. $200. The crowd shifted. Clara lowered her eyes. He was standing at the back of the gathered men, which was why she hadn't noticed him. Tall, broad, through the shoulders, wearing a trail-worn duster the color of dried clay. He had a hat pulled low against the morning sun, and he hadn't pushed his way to the front he'd just spoken, from exactly where he stood, as though he had no particular need to be seen. The auctioneer paused. 200. Do I hear 215? Said the bearded man quickly. He sounded annoyed. 250, the quiet man said. Another pause. Clara was looking at him now. She couldn't help it. There was something in the way he stood, unhurried, contained like a man who had all the time in the world and wasn't particularly worried about any of this that was different from every other man in that square. The others were leaning forward. He was standing still. 275, the bearded man said, and now he was angry. Clara could hear it. 300, the quiet man said. The bearded man swore loudly enough that two women on the far side of the square turned to look. 325, he called. 400. Dead silence. Clara heard her own breath. She heard the auctioneer shuffle his papers. She heard distantly a horse stamp its foot somewhere down the street. The bearded man stared at the quiet man. The quiet man looked back at him with an expression that Clara couldn't read from the platform, not threatening, not triumphant, just patient. Like a man waiting for a storm to pass, certain it would. The bearded man looked away first. Going once at 400, the auctioneer said in a voice that had lost some of its showmanship. Going twice. He looked around. No one moved. Sold. Her father's hand found her arm again, squeezing once, not in comfort, but in something that felt like finality. Deal done. Debt cleared. Problem solved. Clara looked at the man who had bought her, and she felt nothing yet. Not fear, not relief, not hope. She was past feeling for the moment. She was operating on something older and quieter, the simple animal need to stay upright, to not fall, to face whatever came next on her own 2 feet. He was walking toward the platform now. The crowd parted for him without his asking. The way crowds part for men who carry a particular kind of quiet authority. He stopped at the base of the steps and looked up at her. His eyes were dark gray. She noticed that specifically the way you notice details when everything else is too large to process. Dark gray and steady, and looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on a single other face in that square. He looked at her like she was a person. "Miss," he said, "just that." His voice was low and even. Clara Dawson lifted her chin one more fraction of an inch. "Don't," she said. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look offended. He just nodded once, very slightly, like she'd said something that made complete sense. Then he turned to the auctioneer and said, "I'll pay in full." Harold Dawson was grinning. It was the grin of a man who has solved his problem and doesn't want to examine the cost too closely. He shook the auctioneer's hand. He counted the bills the quiet man produced from a coat pocket. Not a wallet, a coat pocket, which meant he'd come prepared, which meant something Clara didn't want to think about yet. He tucked the money into his breast pocket with the satisfied air of a man settling a long account. "Well then," Harold said, turning to the man he'd just handed his daughter to, "she's yours. Clara, go with—" He paused. "Didn't catch your name." "Walker," the man said. "Ethan Walker." "Right. Clara, go with Mr. Walker." Clara descended the platform steps. She stood on the ground beside Ethan Walker and looked at her father, and she waited. She didn't know what she was waiting for. Some acknowledgement. Some sign that this cost him something. Some shadow of the man who had occasionally, when she was very small, called her his girl, and meant it kindly. Harold Dawson patted the breast pocket where the money sat. "You take care now," he said. That was all. He walked back to his wagon, climbed up, clicked his tongue at the horse, and drove away without looking back. Just like that. Clara watched until the wagon turned the corner and disappeared, and she stood very still. And she did not cry because she had promised herself she wouldn't, and she was going to keep one promise today, even if she couldn't keep any others. Ethan Walker stood a pace away from her. He hadn't tried to take her arm or her hand. He hadn't spoken. He was waiting. She realized that after a moment. He was waiting for her. "What happens now?" she said. Her voice was perfectly level. She was proud of that. "That depends on you," he said. She turned to look at him fully for the first time. Up close, she could see that he was older than she'd initially thought, mid-30s maybe, with lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into sun, not from smiling. There was a stillness to him that should have felt threatening given the circumstances, and somehow didn't. "On me," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am. Yes. You just paid $400 for me. Clara said, keeping her voice very careful and very flat. And you're telling me what happens now depends on me. That's right. That doesn't make any sense. Probably not, he agreed. I'd be happy to explain it if you'd rather not stand in the middle of the square. He glanced around. The crowd had mostly dispersed, but there were still eyes on them, curious, speculative, the kind of looking that felt like being handled. I know a place we can talk. Public place. You'd be safe. Clara looked at him. She was a practical woman, her mother had raised her to be, and 6 years of managing Harold Dawson's increasingly chaotic household had finished the job. Practical meant she assessed what she had to work with. She had the clothes on her back, the boots with the cracked sole, and the silver comb in her pocket. She had no money, no horse, no allies in Redstone she trusted completely, and a father who had just demonstrated with brutal efficiency exactly what he thought she was worth. And she had this man who had paid $400 for her and was offering her a chance to sit down and talk about it. All right, Clara said. Talk. He took her to the Redstone Hotel dining room, which at 9 in the morning was nearly empty. Just an old man reading a newspaper in the corner, and a waitress refilling the coffee urns. Ethan Walker chose a table near the window, which meant they could both be seen from the street, and Clara noted that he'd chosen it deliberately. He was aware she realized of how this looked. He was trying to make it less terrible. She sat across from him and folded her hands on the table and waited. He ordered coffee for both of them without asking. When it came, he wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at her directly. I'm going to tell you the truth, he said. All of it. And I'm going to ask you to hear me out before you say anything, because it's going to sound strange, and you're going to have questions, and I'd rather you hold them until I've finished. Can you do that? I managed to hold my tongue through an auction, Clara said. I think I can manage a conversation. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close. Fair enough. He took a breath. My name is Ethan Walker. I run the Bar W Ranch about 12 miles northeast of Redstone. I've been operating it for 8 years. I have 30 head of cattle, a decent horse operation, and 4 hands who've been with me since the beginning. He paused. I'm telling you that not to impress you. I'm telling you so you know I'm not a desperate man. I didn't come to that auction this morning because I needed a woman. I came because I heard it was happening and I couldn't walk away. Clara waited. 3 years ago, Ethan said, and something changed in his voice, not dramatically, but in the way a room changes when a window closes and the outside goes quiet. My sister was 17 years old. She was... He stopped, started again. Our father died when she was 15. Left debts, not unlike yours. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A man named Dawson offered to help with those debts, in exchange for my sister's hand in marriage. She was 17. He was 38. Clara went very still. I was away, Ethan said, working a cattle drive up in New Mexico. By the time I got word and came back, it was done. She was married and gone, and I didn't... He stopped again. Set his coffee cup down. I didn't find her for 2 years, and when I found her she was... He didn't finish that sentence either. She's all right now. She's in Santa Fe with a woman who runs a boarding house there, and she's safe, and she's slowly learning how to be all right again. But it took everything we both had to get her there. Clara's hands were very still on the table. I came to Redstone, Ethan said, because I tracked down the man who did that to her. Harold Dawson. The name landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. I didn't come here to... He paused, choosing his words with evident care. I don't know exactly what I came here to do. I know I wanted to look him in the face. I know I wanted to know why. I know I wanted... A long breath. It doesn't matter what I wanted. What I found when I got here was an auction. His eyes met hers. I heard them calling out bids on a girl in a blue dress, and I watched her stand up on that platform, and I watched her keep her chin up when she had every reason to fold, and I thought... He stopped. You thought what? Clara said. Her voice came out very quiet. I thought nobody was going to help her, Ethan said simply. And I couldn't be that person again. The one who shows up too late. The dining room was very quiet. The old man's newspaper rustled. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pot clanged. "So you bought me," Clara said. "So I bought you," he agreed. "Which is—" He made a small, self-deprecating gesture that sat oddly on such a contained man. "I'm aware of how that sounds. I'm aware it's not better just because I meant it differently. You didn't consent to any of this." "No," Clara agreed. "I didn't. Which is why," Ethan said, and reached into his coat pocket. He set something on the table between them. Bills carefully folded. Clara stared at them. "I want you to take this and go wherever you choose to go. Santa Fe, Tucson, back east if that's what you want. Take the stage or the train, rent a room somewhere safe, find work. That's enough to keep you for 3 months if you're careful, longer if you find something steady." Clara looked at the money. She looked at him. "You're giving me $200. "You're worth more than what was bid," he said, "but it's what I have on me." She sat there for a long moment, looking at the money and listening to the distant sounds of Redstone going about its morning outside the window. Boot heels on boardwalk, a horse's slow clop, someone calling a name down the street. Normal sounds, the sounds of a world that had kept moving while her life turned inside out. "Why didn't you just—" She stopped. Tried again. "You could have simply paid my father. Settled his debt without buying me." "I didn't think of it in time," Ethan said. "By the time I understood what was happening, the auction had started." He paused. "And if I'd paid his debt, he'd have run up another one. You know that as well as I do." She did know it. That was the terrible truth of it. Even now, even with every reason to feel something other than clear-eyed, she knew Harold Dawson's patterns with a precision that came from 20 years of watching them. The debt would be back. It was always back. "What did you come to Redstone to do?" Clara asked. "To my father." "What were you actually going to do?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I hadn't fully decided," he said finally. "I'm not a violent man by nature, but I won't pretend I came here with peaceful intentions." He looked at her steadily. "Finding you changed that. Because I reminded you of your sister. Because you were standing on a platform in the middle of a town full of people, and not one of them was going to help you," he said. "And I know what that is. I know what it costs a person." Clara looked at the money. She looked at her own hands. She thought about Harold Dawson counting bills in his breast pocket and driving away without looking back. She thought about her mother's face, gentle and fierce in equal measure, always looking at her like she was worth something. She thought about this man sitting across from her in a hotel dining room with dark gray eyes and a stillness that felt somehow more trustworthy than most people's loudest declarations. She pushed the money back across the table. Ethan looked at it, looked at her. "Miss Dawson." "I have a question," Clara said. "You said you have a ranch, Bar W, 12 miles northeast." "That's right." "You said you have 4 hands." "Yes." "Do you have anyone managing the house? Cooking, keeping accounts, managing the domestic side of things?" A pause. "Not at the moment. My last, the woman who did that work, left in the spring." "I can cook," Clara said. "I can keep accounts I taught myself from my father's ledgers, which means I can do it accurately because I learned by finding his errors. I can manage a household." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Walker. I'm asking for a job, with wages, and with the understanding that I am an employee, not anything else." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You want to work for me." "I want to work," Clara said. "There's a difference. I want to work and be paid and have somewhere to sleep that isn't my father's house and isn't—" She stopped. "I've never had that. I'd like to know what it is." "It wouldn't be easy," Ethan said. "Ranch work isn't gentle. The men are decent, but it's rough living. I won't pretend otherwise." "Mr. Walker," Clara said very quietly, "I just stood on a platform in the town square and was sold by my own father. I think I can manage rough living." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he nodded. Once carefully, like a man making a decision he'd already thought through. "All right," he said. He went to settle the horses while she finished her coffee, and Clara sat alone in the hotel dining room with $200 on the table in front of her and the particular kind of quiet that comes after something enormous has already happened. She picked up the money. She counted it. She folded it carefully and tucked it into the pocket with her silver comb, not spending it, not returning it, just keeping it where she could feel it. A different kind of security than she'd ever had. Options. She had options. The waitress came to refill her coffee and looked at her with an expression Clara recognized the careful neutrality of a woman who'd seen what happened in the square this morning and didn't know what to say about it. "You all right, honey?" the waitress asked. Clara considered the question seriously. "Not yet," she said, "but I think I'm going to be." She drank her coffee. She watched the street through the window. Somewhere out there, Harold Dawson was driving home to an empty house his debt cleared, and his conscience equally clear, already probably thinking about the next card game, the next easy solution. She thought she should feel something about that. Grief, maybe. Rage. Some complicated tangle of both. What she felt instead was something quieter and more unexpected relief. Not relief that this had happened. Nothing about this morning would ever be something she could call good. But relief that it was done. That the long, grinding uncertainty of living in Harold Dawson's shadow, waiting for the next disaster, the next debt, the next morning, where everything was different and worse, that was done. What came next was unknown. But it was unknown in a way that was hers. She set her empty cup down, straightened her spine, and stood up. Ethan Walker was waiting outside with 2 horses his own and a rented bay mare he'd arranged for her at the stable. He held the reins out without comment. She took them. 12 miles, she said. Give or take. We'll be there before noon. She put her foot in the stirrup and mounted, not gracefully but competently, the way a woman mounts who has ridden when she had to and not often enough to make it easy. Ethan didn't offer to help. She appreciated that. They rode out of Redstone in the full heat of the morning northeastward into the desert, and the town fell away behind them without ceremony. No one came to say goodbye. No one called after her. Clara kept her eyes on the horizon, the red rock ridgeline sharp against the pale sky, the road ahead wide and dusty and entirely uncertain. She had $20 of her own money, a silver comb, a cracked boot, a job she'd negotiated with a stranger who'd bought her freedom without being asked to. She thought this is the first day of something. She didn't know yet what it was the first day of, but it was hers, the first thing in a long time that was entirely hers, and she rode toward it with her chin up and her hands steady on the reins, and she did not look back. Behind her in the Silver Spur Saloon, Harold Dawson ordered his first drink of the day and told himself he'd done what he had to, that the girl would be fine, that it was business, nothing more. He almost believed it, but not quite. And in the quiet of the next morning, when he woke to an empty house and went to the kitchen and found no breakfast waiting, no fire already built, no sound of someone else alive in the rooms, the almost wasn't enough. Harold Dawson sat down at his own table in his own empty house, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt the full weight of what he'd chosen. Whether he would ever do anything about it was another question entirely. One the desert and the long Arizona silence would answer in their own time. The 12 miles to Bar W Ranch passed mostly in silence, and Clara was grateful for it. She'd half expected him to talk, to explain himself further, or ask questions about her, or fill the quiet with the kind of nervous conversation men made when they were uncertain of their footing. Ethan Walker did none of that. He rode at an easy pace, slightly ahead, not so far that it felt like dismissal, not so close that it felt like supervision, and he let the desert do the talking, which it did in its way. The Arizona Territory in September had a particular quality of silence that Clara had grown up inside of and never entirely gotten used to, big and dry and ancient, the kind of silence that made a person feel either very small or very real, depending on what they brought to it. Today, it made her feel real. More real than she'd felt in hours. She thought about the money in her pocket. $200. She'd never held that much at once in her life. She thought about the way Ethan had set it on the table between them, like it was something she was simply owed, not a gift, not a claim, just a correction of something that had been badly wrong. She didn't know what to do with a man like that. She'd spent 20 years inside Harold Dawson's logic, where everything had a price, and nothing was freely given. And the concept of a man who spent $400 and expected nothing back sat in her chest like a word in a language she was still learning to read. She didn't trust it yet. That was honest. But she didn't distrust it either, and for now, that was enough to keep writing. Bar W Ranch announced itself before she could see it, the smell of horses and cut hay and wood smoke threading through the dry air. Then the house itself, low and wide adobe and timber with a long porch across the front and a barn set back and to the left. There were outbuildings she couldn't immediately inventory. A water pump near the barn. A kitchen garden along the south side of the house, gone to the ragged end of summer, but still showing the architecture of someone who'd once tended it carefully. 4 men looked up from various tasks when the horses came in. Clara felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing, not hostile exactly, but assessing. She kept her spine straight and her expression neutral and let them look. Ethan swung down from his horse and turned to her before he said anything to his men. "Miss Dawson, welcome to Bar W." He said it simply like it was a simple thing, and something about that uncomplicated acknowledgement steadied her more than any elaborate courtesy would have. "Thank you," she said, and dismounted without assistance. One of the men, young sun-darkened with the kind of direct gaze that meant either honesty or foolishness, stepped forward. "Boss, didn't expect you back till evening." His eyes moved to Clara quickly, then back to Ethan. "Everything all right in town?" "Changed plans," Ethan said. "This is Miss Clara Dawson. She'll be taking over the house management, cooking accounts, whatever needs doing inside." He looked at his hands evenly. "She's an employee. Same respect as anyone else on this property. More, if anything." The last 2 words landed quietly but clearly. The young man nodded. The other, slightly further back, nodded as well. One older man with a gray-streaked beard, one who looked barely 18, one who kept his eyes down in the careful way of a man who'd learned not to make problems. "This is Tommy," Ethan said, gesturing to the young one. "He's been with me 6 years, which makes him senior hand, despite what his face suggests." Tommy looked briefly indignant. "That's Hector Pete, and the quiet one is Cal. Cal's been with me longest. He doesn't say much, but he'll fix anything that breaks." Cal, the quiet one, nodded at Clara without lifting his eyes. She nodded back. "I'll show you the house," Ethan said to her, and to his men. "The Harker fence line needs checking this afternoon. Tommy, take Hector." He walked toward the porch, and Clara followed. And that was how she came to the house that would change everything through a plain wooden door in the middle of an ordinary September morning, with no ceremony and no fanfare and no idea yet of what ordinary life in this place was going to cost her and give her in equal measure. The house was clean, but empty, in the way houses go empty when they've been managed by people who kept things functional without keeping them alive. Every surface was scrubbed, nothing was out of place, and there was nothing anywhere that suggested anyone actually lived there and was glad to. No flowers in the window, no book left open on a table, no smell of bread or coffee or anything that said someone wanted to be here. Clara walked through the kitchen, the main room a short hallway with 2 closed doors. She opened each door without asking a bedroom at the end of the hall plainly furnished and a smaller room across from it with a cot and a washstand. "That smaller room would be yours," Ethan said from behind her. "I can have the men move the cot out and bring a proper bed frame from the barn. There's a mattress stored there." "The cot is fine. It's not particularly, but I understand if you'd rather not wait." She turned to look at him. He was standing in the hallway with his hat in his hand, and it struck her again this quality he had of taking up exactly the space he needed and no more of being present without pressing. "How long since someone managed the house?" she asked. "Since May. the woman before she left to be closer to family in Tucson. It was a reasonable decision. A pause. I've been managing on my own since, which explains the state of the kitchen garden. The kitchen garden is recoverable, Clara said, moving back toward the kitchen. She opened the dry goods cabinet, assessed the contents, closed it. Opened the icebox, empty as she'd expected this time of year without an ice house. She turned to the cold pantry, found better there, cured pork, some dried beans, cornmeal, a crock of lard. You have 4 men to feed. 5 with me. Any particular, she paused, choosing her phrasing. Any particular things I should know about allergies? Things someone won't eat. Cal won't touch onions. Tommy eats everything you put in front of him and then looks for more. He almost smiled. Hector keeps a small garden of his own near the bunkhouse. He'll likely offer you peppers within the week. Good, Clara said. I'll need them. She was already calculating what she could make tonight, what she'd need from town, what the rhythm of 5 working men's appetites would require. The calculation was familiar, comforting even. She'd been feeding Harold Dawson and managing his household since she was 14, and the work of it had always been the part she didn't mind. The concrete solvable problem of it, the satisfaction of needs met and resources stretched and something coming out of nothing. She had more to work with here than she'd had in years. Wages, she said. We didn't settle on that. What's fair? She named a number. He didn't argue, didn't counter, just nodded. She had the brief, disorienting feeling of being in a negotiation where the other party wasn't trying to win, which was so far outside her experience that she almost named a lower number out of reflex. She didn't. She held the number she'd said, and he agreed to it, and that was that. I'll start dinner in 2 hours, Clara said. Is there anything you need from me before then? No, Ethan said. The house is yours. Do with it what you need to. He put his hat back on and went out, and Clara stood in the middle of the kitchen she'd just been given responsibility for and breathed. Hers. Not hers to own, but hers to run. Hers to manage. The difference was enormous in ways she suspected would take weeks to fully feel. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. Baptism. The first dinner was beans and pork with cornbread and strong coffee, and she made enough of it to be embarrassing because she didn't yet know these men's appetites, and she was not going to run short. She'd grown up running short. She was done with it. They ate at the long table in the main room. Ethan at one end. The 4 hands ranged along the sides, Clara serving and then sitting at the opposite end, when Tommy pulled out a chair for her with a gesture that managed to be both awkward and genuinely courteous. Nobody spoke much at first. Men who worked hard outdoors all day tended to eat with a focus that was its own form of respect for the cook, and Clara had learned years ago not to take that silence personally. It was Cal who spoke first. He looked up from his plate, looked at her directly for the first time and said, "This is the best thing I've eaten since March." March specifically, Clara said. Ethan made a stew in April that I'm still trying to forget. I was present for that comment, Ethan said without looking up from his plate. You were, Cal agreed. He went back to eating. Tommy looked like he was trying not to laugh. Hector across from him permitted himself a small smile. Pete, the quiet one, said nothing, but pushed his plate slightly forward in the universal gesture of a man who wanted more. Clara served him more. Something loosened in the room. Not completely. She was still a stranger. Still an unknown quantity, and she could feel the careful calibration of men who weren't sure yet what she was or what she meant to the person running this ranch. But the food helped. Food always helped. It was the oldest argument she knew. I made this for you, which means I considered you, which means we are at minimum willing to sit in the same room and be human together. After supper, she washed up alone. Ethan offered to help. She declined. She needed the hour of ordinary labor hands, in hot water plates, stacking clean the mindless physical rhythm of a task she'd done 10,000 times. She needed it to be quiet. She was nearly done when she heard the boots on the porch boards not coming in, just someone standing outside. She dried her hands and went to the door. Ethan was sitting on the porch steps, forearms on his knees, looking out at the dark. He didn't turn around when she came out, just shifted slightly to make room on the step. She sat down. Not close, there was a proper distance between them, clear and deliberate. But sitting, which was its own kind of decision. "The men are good," she said. "You've chosen well." "I've been lucky," he said. "Good men are hard to find and easy to lose." "Cal's been with you longest, you said." 7 years. He came with the property, more or less previous owner couldn't pay him, and Cal said he'd rather keep working land he knew than start over somewhere new. I was young enough to think that was simple loyalty. I understand now it was something more complicated. "What is it?" "Home," Ethan said. "People stay for home even when home doesn't look like much." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Did you grow up on a ranch?" "No, town outside of Dallas. My father worked at a dry goods store. He paused. "We were ordinary. Not poor enough to struggle, not comfortable enough to stop worrying. The kind of family that's always about 3 bad months from trouble." "I know that kind of family. I expect you do." He was quiet for a moment. "I came west because I needed to be somewhere that made sense to me. I found that the land did. I understood it better than I understood people for a long time." He looked at his hands. "That has its limits." "Your sister," Clara said carefully. "You said she's in Santa Fe now." "Yes." "Is she? Are you in contact with her?" "Letters," Ethan said. "She writes every few weeks. She's—" He stopped, started again. "She was always brighter than me. Quick with numbers, quick with language. She's helping the woman who runs the boarding house with her accounts now. Starting to teach herself French from a book she found." Something moved across his expression, private and complicated. "She's going to be all right. I think she's going to be more than all right eventually. But it takes time. You can't—" He stopped again. "You can't rush grief," Clara said. "No," he agreed. "You can't." They sat with that for a while. The night was cool and very clear, the kind of sky the desert offered that felt almost excessive in its generosity, more stars than a person knew what to do with. Clara could hear horses in the barn settling. The distant sound of the men in the bunkhouse, low voices, and someone's occasional laughter. "My father came to your family's debts," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, and your sister he offered too." "He presented himself as a solution," Ethan said. His voice had gone very flat, the way a voice goes when it's carrying something heavy and refusing to let it show. "He told my mother he was a man of property and means. He was charming, apparently. She was desperate and frightened, and she thought she was protecting my sister." A pause. "She found out what she'd actually done within the first month. She never stopped blaming herself." "Is your mother—" "She died 2 years ago. I think she was glad to go." He said it without self-pity, just as a fact. "I didn't know how to comfort her, and I'm not sure comfort was even possible at that point. Some things you carry to the end." Clara looked at her own hands in her lap. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know," Ethan said. "You're here partly because of your father, which is connected to what he did to my family, and you didn't know any of that when you agreed to come. That's not fair." He looked at her. "I didn't come to Redstone with clean hands, Miss Dawson. I came with anger and grief and a need for something. I'm not proud of it." "But you didn't do anything," Clara said slowly. "I saw you on that platform," he said, "and everything else became secondary." He shook his head slightly. "I'm not telling you that to make myself sound better than I am. I'm telling you because I need you to understand what happened in that square this morning from my perspective, so that you can decide with clear information whether you want to be here." Clara thought about that for a long moment. "You're giving me another chance to leave." "I'm always going to give you another chance to leave," he said. He paused. "That's the only thing I'm certain I can offer you. You'll always have the choice. I'll never be the reason someone doesn't have a choice again." The word again sat in the silence between them, carrying the full weight of his sister, his mother, the years of too late. Clara understood then what kind of man Ethan Walker was. Not a perfect man, she'd have been suspicious of that. But a man who'd been broken by something and had built himself back along lines of principle rather than comfort, which was harder and more expensive and more reliable. "I'm staying," she said. "Not because I don't have somewhere else to go, because I choose this. I want that understood." Ethan nodded. "Understood. Good." She stood up, brushed dust from her skirt. "I'll need to go to town for supplies in the next day or two. The pantry is workable, but it won't stay that way for long with 5 men eating out of it." "I'll take you tomorrow if you like," he said. "I'd rather go alone if that's possible. If you can spare a horse." He looked at her. "Of course." "Thank you." She went to the door, stopped. "Mr. Walker?" "Ethan?" he said. "Please." She considered that. "Ethan?" The name was different in her mouth than she'd expected, shorter somehow than his formality suggested. "Thank you. For today. For all of it." She found she didn't have better words than that, and she was not a woman who spoke without meaning, so she said the simple ones and let them carry what they could. "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "I know," Clara said. "I'm giving it anyway. There's a difference." She went inside. She didn't sleep well that first night, not because the cot was uncomfortable, though it was, and not because she was afraid, though some small cold part of her was in the way. A body stays afraid even when the mind has reasoned it into calm. She didn't sleep because the silence was wrong, or rather because it was right, and she wasn't used to that yet. Harold Dawson's house had always had a sound at night. Creaking from his room, or the sound of him coming in late, or the tight-held breath silence of a house bracing for what morning would bring. This house was just quiet. Genuinely quiet, with the horses and the night animals outside, and the men in the bunkhouse, and no sound of disaster waiting in the wings. She lay in the dark and thought about her mother, about what Margaret Dawson would have made of today. Not the auction. Clara couldn't quite think about that yet, without a surge of something too large and too hot. But this. The ranch. The man on the porch with his honest accounting of his own darkness. The 4 men who'd gone quiet and respectful when he'd said, "Treat her with the same respect as anyone else." Margaret would have said, "Keep your eyes open and your options clear. Don't mistake kindness for safety. Don't mistake one good day for a pattern." Clara was listening to all of that, and she was also, somewhere underneath it, aware of the particular quality of the silence in this room, in this house, on this property, a silence that asked nothing of her and gave her room to breathe. She hadn't breathed like this in years. She thought, "I am going to have to be very careful here, not because I don't trust him, but because I do, and I don't know yet what to do with that." She pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes and told herself to sleep, and eventually she did. She went to Redstone alone the next morning on a roan horse named Bishop that Ethan told her had the smoothest gait on the property and a reliable sense of direction if she got turned around. She didn't get turned around. She'd lived 12 miles from Redstone her whole life. She spent the morning at the general store loading supplies against the account Ethan had already established. He'd sent a note with her. But when she arrived, the owner, a stocky woman named Mrs. Fraley, already seemed to know who she was. "You're the girl from yesterday," Mrs. Fraley said. Not cruelly, just directly the way women in small towns sometimes were when they'd seen everything and had no energy left for pretense. "I'm Ethan Walker's housekeeper," Clara said. "And I'd like to establish my own account here as well, separate from his. On my own wages." Mrs. Fraley looked at her over the top of her spectacles. Then she got out her ledger and opened it to a new page. "Name, Clara Dawson." "Right then." Mrs. Fraley wrote it down. "Anything else?" "Advice," Clara said. "If you're willing. I'm new to running a working ranch household, and I'd appreciate knowing what I'm likely to run short of before I run short of it." Mrs. Fraley looked at her for another long moment. Then she closed the ledger, put down her pen and said, "Coffee and lamp oil. Always run out of both before you expect to. Buy double whatever you think you need. Now, do you want the good flour or the cheap flour?" "Good flour," Clara said. "Always." "Smart girl," said Mrs. Fraley, and went to get it. She was loading the last of the supplies onto Bishop's packs when she heard a voice behind her that stopped her hands. "Well," the voice said, "look at that. Harold's girl walking around free as you please." She turned. She didn't know the man's name. She'd seen him at the auction, that was all she was certain of. Big, thick beard, the one who'd bid against Ethan and lost. He was standing on the boardwalk with another man she didn't recognize, and he was looking at her with an expression that was somehow both lazy and unpleasant, the look of a man who considered himself owed something. "Thought Walker bought you," the man said. "Thought wrong," Clara said. She turned back to the horse. "Don't think so. I was there. Watched him count out the bills." He stepped off the boardwalk. "Man pays $400 for something he doesn't just—" "He paid $400, Clara said, still not turning around, tightening the pack strap with more force than necessary, for a choice that my father had no right to offer. The transaction was illegal, the product wasn't for sale, and the money is between him and Harold Dawson." She turned then so she could look at the man directly. "I work at Bar W Ranch. I am compensated for that work. I am not anyone's property, and I'd suggest strongly that you think carefully before you say the next thing that's in your head." The man stared at her. He hadn't expected that. Men like him rarely expected it, which was both their greatest weakness and their most dangerous quality. When they were surprised, they could go either direction. "Huh," he said finally. "Mouthy." "Informed," Clara corrected. She gathered Bishop's reins. "Good day." She mounted without hurry, without the tight controlled hurry that her body wanted, but genuine patience, deliberate, and rode out of Redstone at a walk. Only when the town had dropped behind her did she let herself feel the shaking start in her hands, the adrenaline working its way through the retroactive terror of what could have gone sideways. She breathed through it, kept riding. About 2 miles outside of town, she pulled Bishop up and sat for a moment just breathing, just letting the big quiet of the desert do what it did, reduce a person to their actual size, which was small, and also remind them that small wasn't the same as powerless. She thought that man's name. I should know his name. She thought I should know everything I can about everyone in this town. I have started over from nothing before. I have run a household on no money and no help and no credit. I can learn this territory the same way I learned everything else. She thought Harold Dawson still lives 12 miles from here. He is still breathing and spending and running up debts, and that is not nothing. That is a fact I need to carry. She clicked her tongue at Bishop and rode back to the ranch. Charo. She didn't mention the man on the boardwalk to Ethan that evening. She thought about it over dinner, considered it during the cleanup, and decided against it, not because she wanted to hide anything from him, but because she wanted to handle it herself if it came to nothing, and seek help if it became something that required more than herself. That distinction mattered to her. Her whole life had been defined by having no agency, no ability to manage even the small things that affected her directly. She was going to manage her own problems until they were too large to manage alone. What she did mention was the man's face carefully, without the context. "Who's the man in Redstone?" she said, passing the biscuits down the table. "Heavy beard, big hands, was bidding at—" She stopped. The table had gone quiet. "Was at the town square yesterday." "That's Cray Maddox," Tommy said immediately in the tone of a man naming something he knows to be dangerous. "He runs cattle east of town. Rough operation." He looked at his plate. He's not a good man, Miss Dawson." "I didn't think so," Clara said. "Did he approach you?" Ethan asked. He'd stopped eating, she noticed. His hands were flat on the table. "He said some things," Clara said. "I said some things back. I made clear I'm employed, not otherwise, and I left." The table was very still. "He won't let it go," Cal said. It was the most words he'd said at the table yet, and everyone looked at him. He looked back calmly. "Men like Maddox don't let things go. They carry grudges because grudges give them something to do." He looked at Ethan. "He'll see it as an insult, that you outbid him." "I know," Ethan said. "He came by the east fence 2 weeks ago," Hector said quietly from his end of the table. "Said some things about the water rights. wasn't really about the water rights. Clara looked at Ethan. He was already a problem before yesterday. Yes, Ethan said. And you didn't think to mention that when you were making decisions that involved Redstone. A pause. No, I didn't. His jaw tightened once. That was an oversight. It was, Clara agreed, and served herself more beans, and the subject moved on, but not before she'd registered something she filed away carefully. Ethan Walker had a history in this territory that she didn't yet know. Enemies she hadn't accounted for. The world she'd just entered was not the clean beginning it had looked like from the auction platform. Nothing ever was. But she was here now. In it. And she was not. She decided the kind of person who turned away from complicated because it was easier. She was the kind of person who learned the territory and then navigated it. She'd start tomorrow. 3 days into her life at Bar W, Clara found the ledgers. Not found, Ethan gave them to her. He brought them to the kitchen table in the evening after supper, when the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and it was just the two of them in the circle of lamplight, and he set them down and said, "I've been managing the accounts myself since May. I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm competent with cattle. I'm adequate with the numbers. I'd like your assessment." Clara opened the first ledger. She didn't say anything for a long time. She turned pages carefully, following entries tracing the flow of income and outlay. Ethan sat across from her and drank his coffee and waited. "You're being overcharged for feed," she said finally. "I know. I haven't had time to negotiate a better rate. You're also paying 2 different suppliers for the same grade of lumber. One is charging you 20% more." A pause. "I wasn't aware of that. Someone is," Clara said, still looking at the ledger. "The second supplier's invoices are filed separately. If you weren't looking for the comparison, you wouldn't see it." She looked up. "Who files the invoices?" "I do, when I have time, sometimes." He stopped. "Sometimes Tommy." A longer pause. "Sometimes Tommy." Clara looked at Ethan Walker's face, and she saw him arrive at the same place she'd arrived 2 minutes earlier, and she watched him not want to believe it, and she said nothing, because some things a person had to get to at their own pace. "Tommy's been with me 6 years, Ethan said. "I know," Clara said. I trust him." "I know you do." She kept her voice very careful. "I'm not saying he's responsible. I'm saying someone is, and the invoices point in a direction, and you need to know about it." The silence in the kitchen was a different quality now, heavier with a particular kind of pain in it. The pain of possible betrayal, which was one of the sharpest pains there was because it came from love. "I'll look into it," Ethan said. "Let me," Clara said. "I'm new here. I have no history with anyone on this property. I can look at the numbers without caring about the answer." He looked at her across the ledgers in the lamplight, and something moved across his face that she didn't have a name for yet, something that was recognition maybe, or the beginning of it. The look of a man seeing clearly for a moment a person in front of him. "All right," he said. "Look into it. I'll need access to the full year's records. I'll get them tomorrow." "Thank you." She closed the ledger and set it neatly aside. "One more thing." "Yes?" "Cray Maddox," Clara said. "What exactly does he want with your property?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "There's a water source at the northeast corner of my land, spring-fed. Never runs dry, even in drought years." He looked at his coffee. "Maddox's east pasture is dry 7 months out of 12. His cattle operations depend on watering rights he leases from a man who's getting old and likely to sell. If that man sells to the wrong buyer—" "Maddox needs your spring," Clara said. "He needs my spring or he's out of the cattle business within 3 years. And he can't buy it from you." "I've told him no 3 times. Clara thought about the man on the boardwalk. The lazy, unpleasant look of someone who considered himself owed. "Men like that," she said slowly. "When they can't buy something and they can't take it directly, they look for leverage." "I know," Ethan said. "Do you have anything he could use?" Ethan looked at her. "I didn't think I did," he said. "Until yesterday morning." The meaning landed between them slowly, and then all at once. Clara felt cold. "He'll try to use me," she said. Not that way. Something legal, or something that looks legal." Her mind was moving fast the way it moved when she was working out a problem. "The auction yesterday. My father sold me. If someone wanted to argue the legitimacy of that transaction." "It wasn't legitimate," Ethan said. "No court in the territory would uphold it." "Courts in the territory have upheld a great many things they shouldn't have," Clara said. "Especially with the right money behind them." He was looking at her with that same look again, the one she didn't have a name for. "You think like a lawyer," he said. "I think like a woman who's survived Harold Dawson for 20 years, she said. "Same skill set, worse pay." Something crossed his face that was definitely, this time a smile, brief and genuine, and unprepared for the kind that happened before a person could decide not to show it. Clara felt the warmth of it in a way she immediately told herself to be careful about. "I'll talk to my man in Tucson," Ethan said. "He handles legal matters for the ranch. I'll have him look at the auction, the transaction, make sure there's no argument to be made." "Good," Clara said. "And Ethan." She waited until he looked at her. "Don't tell Tommy what I'm doing with the ledgers. Not yet." His jaw tightened. "All right." "I hope I'm wrong," she said. "So do I," he said. "More than you know." She gathered the ledgers into a neat stack, carried them to her room, and sat up for 2 more hours cross-referencing entries by lamplight, the same way she'd learned her father's ledgers once, looking for the place where the numbers stopped telling the truth. She found 3 discrepancies before midnight. 2 small. 1 that was not small at all. She sat with the ledger open on her knee in the narrow room on the narrow cot, and she thought about Tommy, 23 years old. Direct gaze, the one who'd pulled out her chair at dinner. She thought about 6 years of trust, and what it meant, and what it cost when it broke. She thought, "I have been here 4 days, and I am already in the middle of something I don't fully understand." She thought, "That is not new, that is just Tuesday." She blew out the lamp and lay in the dark with the ledger beside her, and listened to the ranch settle into its nighttime sounds. And she told herself she'd figure it out in the morning. In the morning she did. And what she figured out was considerably worse than she'd expected. What Clara had found was this: over a period of 14 months, someone had been skimming from Bar W Ranch's operating account in amounts small enough to miss individually and large enough to matter collectively. Not Tommy. The handwriting on the altered invoices wasn't Tommy's. She'd compared it carefully to his entries in the daily work log Ethan kept on the kitchen shelf. Tommy's handwriting was the cramped, effortful script of a man who'd learned to write late and never made peace with it. The handwriting on the fraudulent invoices was neat, practiced. The handwriting of someone who wrote frequently and professionally. Clara sat with that knowledge for a full morning before she said anything to anyone. She made breakfast, fed, 5 men washed the dishes, went back to the ledgers. She cross-referenced the dates of the altered invoices against the ranch's supply runs, who'd gone to town, who'd handled the paperwork. The pattern was consistent enough to narrow the field considerably. The fraudulent invoices all passed through one supplier, a man named Aldridge, who ran a hardware and dry goods operation on the south end of Redstone's Main Street. Different from Mrs. Fraley's store. Clara hadn't been there yet. She also noted, with the cold precision of a woman cataloging facts rather than feelings, that Aldridge was the married name of the woman who'd once told her she'd give her work if she ever needed it. Whether that was coincidence or connection, she didn't know yet. She knew she needed to go to Redstone again. She told Ethan at lunch, not the full accounting, but enough. "I need to go back to town. There's a supplier I want to look at directly. I have some questions about the invoices." He looked at her across the table. "What did you find?" "I want to be certain before I say," Clara said. "I don't accuse people of things until I'm certain." "Fair enough," he said. "Take Bishop again." "Cal." He looked at his quietest hand. "Ride with Miss Dawson." "I don't need," Clara began. Maddox, Ethan said. Just the name, flat and final. Clara thought about the boardwalk. The thick-bearded man with the unpleasant, lazy certainty. All right, she said. Cal? Cal nodded once, chewed his biscuit, and said nothing. They rode to Redstone in the early afternoon, Cal half a length behind her in the easy, unobtrusive way of a man who understood that protection didn't require hovering. Clara appreciated it. She appreciated more broadly that Cal seemed to have a finely developed sense of when to be present and when to be invisible, which was a rare quality and a useful one. She went to Aldridge's store alone, while Cal waited outside with the horses. The man behind the counter was somewhere in his 50s, lean with the careful pleasantness of a merchant who'd learned that being liked was good for business. He smiled when she came in. "What can I do for you, miss?" "My name is Clara Dawson," she said. "I manage the household accounts at Bar W Ranch. I'm reviewing some of our supply invoices, and I have a few questions about orders from the past year." The smile didn't change, but something behind it did. "Of course, happy to help. Do you have the invoice numbers?" She did. She'd written them on a folded piece of paper in her pocket. She set the paper on the counter and watched his eyes move across the numbers. His hands, she noticed, were very still. "These orders," she said, "were billed at rates about 20 to 25% above what your posted prices would indicate. I'd like to understand the discrepancy." "Prices fluctuate," he said. The pleasantness was still there, but it had the quality now of a coat being held on against weather. "Freight costs seasonal variation. The freight costs are listed separately on each invoice," Clara said. "They don't account for the gap." She kept her voice level and pleasant, matching his register exactly. "I'm not here to make accusations, Mr. Aldridge. I'm here to understand the numbers. If there's an explanation, I'm glad to hear it and note it in the accounts. If there isn't..." She paused. "Well, then we'd need to have a different conversation." The pleasantness dropped. Just slightly, not gone, but thinned like ice you can see the water through. "Those invoices were approved," he said. "By whom?" A pause just long enough to be informative. "The ranch's authorized agent." "And who is the ranch's authorized agent?" "That would be..." He stopped. "I'd like a name," Clara said gently. Aldridge looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man calculating his options and finding none of them good. "I think," he said carefully, "that you should speak with whoever handles the legal arrangements on behalf of Bar W Ranch." "I intend to," Clara said. "But first, I'd like your ledger entries for these transactions. The full entries including who authorized payment." "I'm not obligated to." "You're not," Clara agreed. "But if I have to bring a legal representative to this counter, the conversation becomes considerably more formal and considerably more expensive for everyone involved." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm offering you the informal version, Mr. Aldridge. It's the better deal." The silence in the store stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Then Aldridge reached under the counter and brought out his own ledger. She had what she needed within 20 minutes, and she was back on Bishop with Cal riding silent beside her before the afternoon heat peaked. She didn't speak on the ride home. She was organizing what she'd found into an order that would make sense when spoken aloud, stripping out the parts that were still assumption-keeping, only what could be evidenced. Here was what could be evidenced. Bar W Ranch had been billed at fraudulent rates by Aldridge's store. The authorization on those invoices was a signature she recognized from the legal documents Ethan had shown her that morning, documents related to the ranch's water rights dispute with Maddox. The same signature appeared on both, and it was not Ethan's signature, and it was not Tommy's, and it was not any of the hands. It was the signature of the man Ethan had described as his lawyer in Tucson, a man named Gerald Fitch. Clara rode back to Bar W with that name sitting in her chest like a coal hot and hard, and requiring careful handling, because what it meant, if it meant what she thought it meant, was that Ethan Walker was not just facing harassment from Cray Maddox. He was facing something that had been methodically constructed from the inside by a man he trusted with his legal affairs and his financial records over at least 14 months. And it was possible she didn't know yet. But it was possible that it was connected to the water rights dispute in a way that went far beyond overcharged invoices. She needed to think. She needed to think very carefully before she said a word to Ethan Walker. She said it that evening after supper, after the men had gone in the same circle of lamplight where they'd looked at the ledgers 2 nights before. She laid out what she'd found in the order she'd organized it, the invoices, the rates, the authorization signature, the name. She put the paper with her notes on the table between them and let him read it. He read it twice. She watched his face. The first time he read it, his expression was the careful neutrality of a man processing information he doesn't want to receive. The second time something had shifted, the neutrality was still there, but underneath it was something harder and colder, the look of a man who has been betrayed before and is recognizing the shape of it again. "Gerald Fitch," he said. "Yes. Gerald Fitch has handled my legal affairs for 4 years. "I know," Clara said. "He drew up the water rights documentation. He filed my deed claims with the territorial office." Ethan set the paper down. His hands were flat on the table, very still. "He's been in my home." "I know," Clara said again quietly. "And you found this in 2 days?" "I found it because I was looking at the numbers without knowing whose they were," Clara said. "You couldn't see it because you trusted him. That's not a failure of intelligence, Ethan. It's a failure of his character, not yours." He was quiet for a long moment. "What's his connection to Maddox?" "I don't know yet, but there is one. The timing of the altered invoices corresponds with the period when Maddox began pressuring you about the water rights, and the authorizations on the fraudulent documents and the water rights filings have the same signature. That's not coincidence." "Fitch has been feeding him information," Ethan said slowly. "About my finances, my operations. At minimum," Clara said. "At worst." She paused, choosing words carefully. "At worst, the water rights documentation itself may not be entirely clean." The silence after that was long. "Tell me what you mean," Ethan said. His voice had gone very quiet in the way that wasn't calm, the way that was the thing underneath, calm held in place by will. "The water rights filing. Did you read it in full before you signed?" "Of course." "Did Fitch explain what each clause meant?" Yes, broadly." "Did he explain the contingency clause on page 4? Ethan went very still. "What contingency clause?" Clara opened the copy she'd made of the water rights document. Ethan had given her access to all his files, a decision she was increasingly grateful for, and turned to page 4. She set it in front of him and pointed. He read it. He read it again. "That clause," Clara said, "as written, gives a third party the right to petition the Territorial Land Office for reassessment of water access rights if the primary claimant fails to maintain continuous beneficial use for a period of 18 months. She let that sit for a moment. "Bar W's cattle operation ran short on hands last winter. You moved most of the herd to the south pasture for 4 months. The northeast spring was in limited use. That was a management decision," Ethan said. "Standard ranching practice." "Yes," Clara said. "But under this clause as written, it could be argued as a failure of continuous beneficial use." She met his eyes. "Someone who knew your operations well enough to know about last winter's herd movement, someone who perhaps learned about it from a man you trusted with your legal affairs, could use this clause to petition for reassessment. And if the reassessment went to Maddox, he gets access to the spring, legally, through a process that would look entirely legitimate in a territorial court." Clara kept her voice even and her hands still and let the full shape of it land on Ethan Walker's face without interrupting. "The overcharging was money. This is the ranch. This is everything." Ethan stood up from the table. He walked to the window, stood there for a moment with his back to her. "How long," he said, "before this can be filed?" "The 18 months runs out in 6 weeks, Clara said. He turned around. 6 weeks. "Yes." "Has he filed already, Maddox?" "I don't know. I couldn't access the Territorial Land Office records from here." She paused. "I'd need to go to Tucson." The word landed in the room and settled there Tucson, where Gerald Fitch's office was, where the territorial records were kept, where the threat either already existed on paper or hadn't been filed yet. "I'll go," Ethan said. "We should both go," Clara said. "I found this. I know what I'm looking for. And—" She hesitated. "If Fitch sees you coming, he has time to manage what you find. He doesn't know about me." Ethan looked at her across the table. "You want to walk into Gerald Fitch's territory and dig through his records without him knowing what you're doing. I want to walk into the Territorial Land Office and request public records," Clara said. "Which I have the right to do as any citizen. Fitch's records are a separate question." Clara. It was the first time he'd used her name without the miss, and she noted it somewhere in the part of her that was tracking everything. "This is dangerous. If Maddox is behind this, if Fitch is working for him, then there are already dangerous people who know about this ranch and want it," Clara said. "The danger exists whether I go to Tucson or not. The only question is whether we go in knowing what we're facing or find out when it's too late." He looked at her for a long time. "When can you be ready to leave?" he said finally. "Tomorrow morning," Clara said. They told the men only that they had business in Tucson and that Cal was in charge in their absence. Cal received this information with his customary absence of visible reaction, which Clara had come to understand meant he'd accept the responsibility and handle it competently. Tommy asked how long they'd be gone. Hector offered to pack food for the road. Pete said nothing. Clara packed her traveling bag that night, spare dressed the ledger copies she'd made her notes, the money from her pocket. She lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling and ran through what she knew and what she suspected and what she could prove, which were 3 different categories requiring 3 different kinds of attention. She could prove the fraudulent invoices. She had Aldridge's ledger entries and the authorization signatures and the rate comparisons. She suspected Fitch was feeding Maddox information about Bar W's operations, possibly in exchange for money, possibly in exchange for a stake in whatever Maddox stood to gain from the water rights. She could not yet prove that the water rights filing was deliberately structured to be exploitable. That would require reading the original filing against established territorial law. And she was not a lawyer. What she was a woman who had read every book in her mother's house, including a copy of Blackstone's commentaries that had belonged to a grandfather she'd never met, and had spent her adult life arguing her own case in Harold Dawson's house, which had been its own form of legal education. She thought, "I need someone in Tucson who knows territorial law and isn't Gerald Fitch." She thought, "I have never been to Tucson. I have barely been past Redstone. And I am going there in 2 days to confront a fraud that could cost a man his entire livelihood." She thought, 6 weeks ago I didn't have a choice about anything. Now I have more choices than I know how to hold. She fell asleep with the ledger still open on the cot beside her. They left at first light, the desert cool and gray in the early morning, and they rode for an hour before either of them spoke much. Ethan had the contained quality he always had, but this morning it was different, tighter a wire rather than a still pond. Clara could feel the tension in the way he sat on his horse, the occasional tightness around his jaw when he looked at the road ahead. "Tell me about Fitch," she said when the light had warmed enough to feel like day. "How you found him. How you came to trust him." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He was recommended by a man I respected. Rancher north of Tucson, good man, long history in the territory. Said Fitch had handled his deed claims and handled them well." He looked at the road. "We met once before I hired him. He seemed thorough, careful, the kind of man who read the whole document before he signed anything." "He probably did read the whole document," Clara said. "He wrote most of them." "Yes." A beat. "I should have had someone else review them." "You trusted a referral from a man you respected," Clara said. "Most people would have done the same." "Most people would have," he agreed. "But I've been burned by trust before. I should have known better." She looked at his profile. "You mean your sister?" He didn't answer immediately. "After what happened with Rose, that's her name, Rose, I told myself I'd never again trust without verification. That I'd look at everything with clear eyes and not—" He stopped. And then I hired Gerald Fitch on a handshake and a referral, and I didn't look at a single document he gave me with anything like clear eyes. Because he seemed like the solution, Clara said. And you were tired of problems. He looked at her. Yes, exactly that. People do that, Clara said. It's not weakness, it's human. You can only run on vigilance for so long before you have to trust something. I trusted the wrong thing. You trusted a man who chose to be untrustworthy. There's a difference. He was quiet for another stretch of road. Then, you're very certain about where the fault lies. I've had a lot of practice figuring out who's actually responsible for things, Clara said. Living with Harold Dawson, you learn early that people who cause harm like to make it seem like the harm was inevitable, like no one chose anything. She kept her eyes on the road. Someone always chose, and it's almost never the person who got hurt. Ethan rode beside her and said nothing for a while. But something had eased in the way he held himself, some small fraction of the tightness gone, the wire a little less taut. Your father, he said carefully. Have you thought about what you want to happen with him? That's a question I've been avoiding, Clara said honestly. You're allowed to avoid it. I know, but avoiding it doesn't make it not there. She thought about Harold Dawson sitting at the kitchen table the morning he'd told her to put on her good dress, the way he hadn't looked at her, the way he'd counted the bills. I don't want revenge, she said finally, testing the words to see if they were true. They were mostly. I don't think it would give me what people imagine it gives them. I've seen what it does to people. Carrying that much anger is like carrying a hot coal. You think you're saving it to throw at someone, and really you're just burning your own hand. But, Ethan said, because he heard the but she hadn't said. But I don't want him to do it again, Clara said. To someone else. There will be another debt, and another... She stopped. There will be someone else's daughter. The silence between them was different now, not empty, but full. Full of the specific weight of two people who'd been damaged by the same man, sitting with that knowledge in the open air for the first time. Rose was 16 when it started, Ethan said. Harold came to my mother with his gentleman's manners and his fine words, and my mother was so frightened she didn't ask the questions she should have. His voice was level, factual, the way a person talks about a wound they've learned to describe without reopening. He married Rose in a civil ceremony with a judge Harold knew, took her to his property, and then... He stopped. She was there for 14 months before she managed to get a letter out to me. 14 months, Clara said. Yes. She thought about those 14 months in a way she hadn't let herself think about it before, what they meant for a 16-year-old girl, what they cost, what kind of damage 14 months could do to a person who hadn't had anyone to help them. She felt sick and cold, and something else. Something that was specifically about Harold Dawson, and specifically about the fact that he'd done this while she was living in his house, and she hadn't known. She hadn't known. I didn't know, she said. About Rose, about any of it. I know you didn't, Ethan said. I would have. She stopped, because what would she have done? She'd been 16 herself when it started. 17 when Rose would have been struggling through those 14 months in Harold Dawson's house. She'd been a child, managing a drunk man's failing farm, and she wouldn't have known. And even if she had, you couldn't have stopped it, Ethan said quietly. You were a child. You were his child. Don't absolve me just to be kind, Clara said sharply. I'm not being kind, he said. I'm being accurate. There's a difference. She breathed. In the dust and the morning heat and the slow rhythm of horses, she breathed. What happened when you got to her? She asked finally. She was... He took a careful breath. She was alive. She hadn't been. He hadn't been violent in the way I feared most. But there are ways to hurt people that don't leave the marks that courts recognize. His jaw tightened. She was 20 pounds lighter than when I'd last seen her. She didn't speak above a whisper for the first 3 days. She flinched at loud sounds. He paused. She was 17 years old. And Harold? Clara asked. He was in Redstone by then, Rose had she'd found a woman in the nearest town who helped her get word to me. By the time I arrived, Harold had already moved on. Something cold crossed Ethan's face. I found out later he'd told people she'd left him. Said she was ungrateful. He paused. Said she wasn't right in the head. Clara felt the fury arrive the way fury does when it's been building somewhere below conscious thought, sudden and total like a door blowing open. She pressed it down because this was not the time and not the place, and because fury without direction was just pain. "We're going to stop him," she said. "However this ends with Fitch and Maddox, that's separate. Stopping Harold is separate, and we're going to do it." Ethan looked at her. "Clara, I know what he did," she said. "To Rose. To me. To whatever comes after me and after Rose if nothing stops him." Her voice was steady. "I know things about Harold Dawson that no one else knows. His patterns, his contacts, the names of the men he gambles with, the judges he knows. I lived in that house for 20 years, and I paid attention." She met Ethan's eyes directly. "We're going to deal with Fitch and Maddox first, because we have 6 weeks, and that's the immediate fire. But after that, Harold is next." Ethan held her gaze for a long moment. "You mean that?" "I mean everything I say," Clara said. "I thought you'd gathered that by now." Something happened in his expression, a kind of quiet opening, like a room getting more light. "I'm beginning to," he said. They reached Tucson on the second day in the late afternoon. Rode dusty and tired and found rooms at a respectable hotel near the center of town. Separate rooms adjacent, which Ethan arranged without her having to say anything about it, which she appreciated. She washed the road off her face and hands, changed her dress, and spent the last hour of daylight in the hotel lobby with the copy of the water rights document and a legal reference volume she'd requested from the hotel's small library, a collection of Arizona territorial statutes and precedents, dry as the climate and twice as useful. She found what she was looking for on page 112. The contingency clause in Bar W's water rights filing was not standard language. It was a modified version of a legitimate territorial clause, but the modification was subtle enough that it required side-by-side comparison to detect. The original territorial statute required 18 months of complete abandonment for a reassessment petition to be valid. Fitch's modification changed the language from complete abandonment to failure to maintain continuous beneficial use, a phrase with a far broader legal interpretation. In other words, the original law protected ranchers who temporarily shifted their operations for legitimate management reasons. Fitch's version exposed them to reassessment anytime a creative lawyer could argue their use had lapsed. It was elegant, and it was devastating, and it had been sitting in Bar W's filed documents for 4 years waiting for someone to use it. She brought the comparison to Ethan's room and knocked. He opened the door in shirt sleeves, which she noted with the same part of her that noted everything. And she came in because this was not the moment for propriety, and she'd decided they were past certain kinds of distance anyway. And she put both documents on the small table and showed him the comparison. He read it. He read it again. She watched his face go through the same sequence she'd gone through: confusion, understanding a deep and cold fury. "He filed this 4 years ago," Ethan said. "He was planning this 4 years ago. Or he was paid to create the vulnerability 4 years ago and then waited for someone to use it," Clara said. "Which means whoever is behind this has been patient." "Maddox has been patient," Ethan said. "Yes, but Maddox is not a subtle man. The man on the boardwalk in Redstone, the one who bid against you at the auction, that's not a man who constructs 4-year legal strategies." She paused. "Someone is working with him who is smarter than he is." Ethan looked at her. "Fitch." "Fitch is one possibility," Clara said. "Or Fitch is working for someone who is smarter than Maddox and smarter than Fitch. You think there's a third party. I think," Clara said carefully, "that a hardware store owner overcharging a ranch, a lawyer doctoring legal documents, and a cattleman with a water problem all converging on the same property at roughly the same time is a great deal of coincidence for coincidence to explain." She spread her notes on the table. Bar W Ranch has the only permanent water source in a 12-mile radius. Who benefits if Ethan Walker loses this property entirely, not just the water rights, but the property itself? Ethan stared at the notes. If Maddox gets the water rights through a reassessment petition, and if the financial records show the ranch is operating at a loss, which they would if Fitch has been bleeding it, a ranch that can't maintain its financial obligations can be forced to sale, Clara said quietly. And if Maddox buys it, he gets the water, the land, and everything on it, Clara finished, for far less than market value, because the market value will have been deliberately undermined. She looked at him steadily. Ethan, has Maddox ever offered to buy this property outright? Twice, he said slowly. Once 3 years ago, once last spring. Both times I refused. And both times what was the offer relative to what Bar W is worth? A long pause. Low, he said. Both times well below what I'd consider. Artificially low, Clara said, because whoever is behind this knew what the property would be worth after they were done with it. The room was very quiet. Tomorrow, Ethan said. We go to the land office first, then to Fitch's office. Not Fitch's office, Clara said. Not directly. First we find a different lawyer. Someone in Tucson with territorial court experience who isn't connected to Fitch. She paused. And then we find out if a petition has already been filed. And if it has, Clara looked at the documents on the table, the careful fraud she'd traced through numbers and signatures and the modified language of a single clause, and she thought about 6 weeks and Rose Walker and Harold Dawson and a little girl standing on a platform in a blue dress, and she thought about what it meant to have options, to be a person with options, and what you were supposed to do with them. Then we fight it, she said. In court with evidence, and we win. Ethan looked at her across the table, the lamp between them, the documents spread like a map of someone else's careful cruelty, the Tucson night quiet outside the window. I should tell you something, he said. She waited. When I came to Redstone, he said, I told you I came for Harold, that I came with anger, and that finding you changed that. He paused. That's true, but it's not complete. Tell me the complete version, Clara said. I came to Redstone, Ethan said, because I had information that Harold Dawson had recently contacted someone in connection with a land transaction, a large one. I thought it was one of his gambling debts that he was trying to leverage some piece of land to clear a note. He stopped. The name of the person Harold contacted the person he was apparently negotiating with was Gerald Fitch. The silence was absolute. Clara felt the floor of the situation shift under her feet, not collapse but change the way a current changes beneath still water. Harold, she said slowly, my father, was in contact with your fraudulent lawyer. Yes. Before the auction. At least 2 months before the auction. She looked at him across the lamp. Her mind was moving very fast in the way it moved when a pattern clarified, when the scattered pieces suddenly showed their shape. The auction wasn't about his debt, she said. Not entirely. I don't know, Ethan said. That's the honest answer. I don't know what Harold knew or intended, but the connection is there. He sold me to pay Vic Crane, Clara said. That part was real. Crane's debt was real. I've known about it for months. She was thinking out loud now, pulling thread. But if Harold was also in contact with Fitch, if Fitch told him what Maddox wanted, if someone suggested that creating chaos around Bar W Ranch at just the right moment would serve a larger purpose. That's speculation, Ethan said carefully. Yes, Clara agreed. But it's very organized speculation. She stood up. She went to the window. Outside, Tucson moved through its evening lights and voices and horses and the business of a territorial city that didn't know or care about Bar W Ranch or the water in its northeast corner or the network of greed and patience that had been quietly, methodically working to take it apart. Ethan, she said without turning around, how much did you know about Fitch's connection to Harold when you came to Redstone? I knew there was a connection, he said. I didn't know what it meant. But you came anyway. Yes. Why? He was quiet for long enough that she turned around. Because whatever Harold's connection to this was, Ethan said Rose's connection to Harold was real and separate from it, and I needed to see the man's face. He held her gaze. And because when I got there, I saw you on that platform, and... He stopped. And nothing else seemed as important as the thing that was happening right in front of me. Clara looked at him across the small lamp-lit room in the Tucson hotel with the documents between them and the night outside and the shape of the next 6 weeks waiting to be made. And she felt the thing she'd been carefully managing and measuring and keeping at a proper distance do something she hadn't quite authorized it to do. She felt it arrive, not with drama, not with any of the machinery of romance she'd read about in her mother's books, just arrival. The quiet, absolute recognition of someone being real to you in a way that changes the shape of the room. She looked away first. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow is a long day." "Clara?" She turned at the door. "Thank you," he said. "For all of this. For..." He seemed to reach for the right words and find them insufficient. "For being who you are." She stood in the doorway for a moment. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We haven't won anything yet." She went to her room. She lay in the dark. She thought about Harold Dawson and Gerald Fitch and Cray Maddox and the shape of the thing they were inside of the size and patience of it, the 4 years of careful construction aimed at dismantling one man's life. She thought about Ethan Walker saying nothing else seemed as important as the thing that was happening right in front of me. She thought 6 weeks. We have 6 weeks. And I know the territory now, and I know the numbers, and I know what I'm fighting, and I know who I'm fighting beside. She thought that is more than I've ever had. She closed her eyes, and she did not sleep quickly. But when she slept without dreaming of auction platforms, or her father's turned back, or men calling out numbers in a dusty square. She dreamed of the ranch instead, the kitchen in the morning. The smell of coffee, 5 men eating breakfast she'd made, and the silence of the desert afterward, enormous and clean, and full of room to breathe. The Territorial Land Office opened at 8 o'clock in the morning, and Clara was standing outside its door at 7:55. Ethan stood beside her. Neither of them had slept particularly well, and neither of them mentioned it, which was its own form of understanding. They'd eaten breakfast at the hotel in near silence, not the uncomfortable silence of people with nothing to say, but the focused silence of people conserving themselves for what was ahead. The clerk who opened the land office door was young, efficient, and visibly surprised to find 2 people already waiting. Clara gave him her most straightforward smile and said she was there to review public records related to a specific water rights filing, and could he direct her to the correct register. He could. He did. She found the petition within 20 minutes. It had been filed 11 days ago. Petition for reassessment of water. Access rights. Bar W Ranch filed on behalf of Cray Maddox of Maddox Cattle Operations, citing failure of continuous beneficial use under Section 14, subsection 3 of the Arizona Territorial Land Code. Section 14, subsection 3. The modified language Fitch had embedded in Bar W's original filing 4 years ago, now being used precisely as it had been constructed to be used. Clara stood at the records counter and read the petition twice carefully, the way she read everything, not for the general shape of it, but for every specific word, every date, every signature. Then she took out her notebook and copied the key details by hand, quickly and accurately. "Problem?" Ethan asked beside her. "It's been filed," she said quietly. 11 days ago. His jaw tightened once. "How long before it's heard?" "Petition says a preliminary hearing is scheduled." She found the line. 23 days from the filing date, which means 12 days from today, Ethan said. "Yes." 12 days. That changed the arithmetic considerably. 6 weeks had felt like room to work. 12 days was barely enough time to find a lawyer, build a case, and prepare for a hearing, and that assumed everything went smoothly, which nothing about this situation had done so far. Clara copied the last details, closed her notebook, and looked at the clerk. "I need the name of a territorial attorney," she said. "Someone with experience in land rights cases in this district. Someone not affiliated with a man named Gerald Fitch." The clerk blinked. "I'm not really supposed to—" "I understand," Clara said pleasantly. "I'm not asking for a formal referral. I'm asking if you personally know of anyone competent and honest. Those two qualities together in a lawyer. I'm aware it narrows the field." The clerk looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote a name on a slip of paper and slid it across the counter without saying anything. She took it. "Thank you." The name on the paper was Samuel Hart. The address was 4 blocks east. Samuel Hart was 63 years old, thickly built with white hair and the unhurried manner of a man who had seen enough territorial court to stop being surprised by anything. His office smelled like tobacco and old paper and the specific mustiness of legal volumes used frequently enough to stay warm. He listened to Clara for 20 minutes without interrupting. She laid out everything: the modified clause, the fraudulent invoices, Fitch's signatures, the connection to Harold Dawson, the filing date, the hearing date. She put her copies of the documents on his desk in the order she'd organized them, which was not the chronological order, but the evidentiary order, the order that built the clearest case. When she finished, Hart was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How did you find all of this?" "I looked at the numbers," Clara said. "And I read the documents completely." "Fitch has been operating in this district for 8 years, Hart said. "I've suspected him of creative lawyering for at least 4, but creative lawyering is difficult to prove." He looked at the documents. "This is not difficult to prove. You've done the difficult part already." He looked at her directly. "Who are you, Miss Dawson, professionally?" "I'm a ranch housekeeper," Clara said. Hart looked at the organized evidentiary spread on his desk. He looked at her. "No," he said mildly. "I don't think that's what you are, but we can discuss it later." He turned to Ethan. "Mr. Walker, I can file a counter motion today challenging the validity of the petition on the grounds that the underlying clause was fraudulently modified in the original filing. The hearing in 12 days becomes a hearing on the legitimacy of the clause itself, not on your use of the water." He paused. "If we can prove the modification was deliberate and material, the petition fails and Fitch faces disbarment proceedings." "Can we prove it?" Ethan asked. Hart tapped the comparison Clara had made the original territorial statute beside Fitch's modified version, the differences marked in her neat handwriting. "Miss Dawson already proved it," he said. "What we need now is a witness." "Aldridge," Clara said immediately. Both men looked at her. "The supplier in Redstone," she said. "He knows who authorized the fraudulent invoices. He's already nervous I pushed him 2 days ago, and he gave me his ledger entries without much resistance. A formal legal inquiry will push him the rest of the way." She paused. "He's a small man who made a bad arrangement with bigger men. He'll cooperate if he believes cooperating is safer than not cooperating." Hart looked at her again with that same expression, the careful reassessment of a man realizing someone is not what he initially catalogued. "I'll draw up the counter-motion this morning," he said. "Can you both be available this afternoon to review and sign?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Good." Hart gathered the documents into a tidy pile. "One more thing. The connection you've described between this Fitch Maddox and a man named Harold Dawson that suggests a coordinated scheme to defraud a landowner and force a sale under duress. In this territory that carries serious criminal weight." He looked at Ethan. "Do you want to pursue that separately?" Ethan looked at Clara. Clara thought about Harold Dawson. She thought about Rose Walker, 17 years old, 20 pounds lighter, speaking in a whisper. She thought about the auction platform and her father's breast pocket and the sound of the bills being counted. "Yes," she said, "we do." They spent the morning at Hart's office and the early afternoon at a separate government office where Ethan filed a formal complaint against Gerald Fitch with the Territorial Bar Association. The complaint cited the modified clause, the fraudulent invoices, and the signature evidence connecting Fitch to both. The Bar Association clerk received it with the particular expressionless efficiency of a person who has processed important documents often enough that importance no longer registers on his face. It registered on Clara's. She felt it the heft of the formal complaint in the official register, the way a name written in ink in a government ledger becomes something different from the same name spoken in a hotel room. More real, more permanent, more dangerous to the person it named. She thought this is what power looks like when you do it right. Not loud, not violent, just precise. They were walking back to the hotel when Ethan stopped. She stopped too, because he'd stopped suddenly the way a person stops when they've seen something that requires stillness. She followed his gaze. Across the street, coming out of a building with a brass plate beside the door that she was too far away to read clearly, was a man she'd never seen before. Medium height, well-dressed for Tucson, with the kind of carefully composed appearance that took effort and intention. He was talking to someone beside him, the someone being a broad, thick-bearded figure that Clara recognized immediately. Cray Maddox, in Tucson, today. "The building with the brass plate," she said quietly. "What is that?" Ethan's voice was very controlled. "That's Gerald Fitch's office." They watched from across the street as Maddox and the well-dressed man spoke for another 30 seconds on the steps of Fitch's building with the easy familiarity of people who have met in this way before. Then they separated, Maddox going one direction, the well-dressed man going back inside. "Who was the other man?" Clara asked. "I don't know," Ethan said. "I've never seen him." "He wasn't Fitch." "No, I know Fitch by sight. That wasn't him." Clara looked at the door that had just closed. At the brass plate, she still couldn't read from here. "Stay here," she said. "Clara." "I'm going to read the sign," she said. "I'll be 30 seconds. She crossed the street before he could argue, walked past Fitch's building, at a pace that was purposeful, but not hurrying the pace of someone who has somewhere to be, and is going there, and read the brass plate as she passed. Law offices of Gerald Fitch and Associates. And below Fitch's name, a second name, Thomas Aldrich Crane, attorney at law. Crane. She kept walking, turned the corner, stood for a moment with her back against the wall, and her heart doing something faster than usual, because Crane was not an uncommon name in the territory, and it was possible, completely possible, that this was coincidence. But she thought about Vic Crane, Harold Dawson's creditor, the man whose $460 debt had put Harold in a position desperate enough to auction his daughter. She thought about the fact that the auction had cleared Harold's debt to Crane, and that 2 months earlier, Harold had been in contact with Gerald Fitch. She thought about the well-dressed man coming out of Fitch's office, the ease with which he'd talked to Maddox. She thought, what if the debt was never about gambling at all? She went back to Ethan and told him what she'd seen. They were back in Hart's office within the hour. The old lawyer listened to the addition with the same patient attention he'd given everything else. And when Clara finished, he leaned back in his chair and made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a word, the sound of a man having a larger picture confirmed. "Thomas Crane," he said. "I know the name. He's been associated with Fitch for approximately 2 years. Before that, he was in land speculation, mostly failed." He looked at his desk. "He has family in Redstone, I believe. A brother who runs some kind of money-lending operation." "Vic Crane," Clara said. "He's a creditor. He held a debt over my father." Hart was quiet for a moment, the precise quiet of a man doing arithmetic. "So," he said slowly, "a creditor in Redstone holds debt over a man with a daughter. A lawyer in Tucson, connected to that creditor's brother, engineers a legal vulnerability in a nearby ranch's water rights filing. A cattleman who needs that water begins applying pressure, and at the critical moment," he looked at Clara, "the creditor calls in the debt, forces the father into a desperate position. The daughter ends up on an auction platform," Clara said. "Removing her from the ranch's vicinity," Hart said. "Or if the buyer is the wrong kind of man, creating a scandal that could be used to pressure the rancher." He paused. Because a man who bought a woman at auction under any circumstances is vulnerable to a very particular kind of legal and social exposure. The room was absolutely still. Clara turned to look at Ethan. He was sitting very quietly, and the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen before. Not the taut, controlled anger, not the still patience, but something underneath both of those. Something that was specifically about her, about what she'd just heard about what had nearly happened. "They were going to use you against me," he said. It wasn't a question. "If the wrong man had bought me," Clara said, keeping her voice even with an effort, "yes. There would have been something, a claim, a scandal, something to force your hand." She paused. "Or if no one bought me at all, if I'd been left in that situation, there would have been something else. Something about you knowing and not acting." "Either way," Ethan said. "Either way, Bar W Ranch becomes difficult to defend in a territorial court while its owner is managing a public controversy," Clara finished. "And a ranch that can't defend its water rights, that's financially compromised, whose owner is distracted by scandal, that ranch is for sale. For whatever Maddox offers." Hart had been listening to this exchange with his hands folded and his expression thoughtful. "The auction," he said, "was 11 days before the petition was filed." "Yes," Clara said. "The timing is not coincidental." "No," Clara said. "I don't think anything about this has been coincidental." Hart unfolded his hands. "All right," he said. "Here is what we're going to do. The counter-motion challenges the petition on the fraudulent clause. That protects the water rights in the short term. Simultaneously, I will file a request with the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for an investigation into Fitch and Thomas Crane on the grounds of coordinated fraud. That is a separate proceeding and will take longer, but the filing itself creates a record." He looked at Clara. "And I will need a sworn statement from you about the auction, about what you observed regarding the connection between your father Vic Crane and the sequence of events." "I'll give you one," Clara said. "It will be made part of the formal record," Hart said. "It will be public." She thought about that for exactly 3 seconds. Public. Her name, her father, the auction platform, the humiliation that had been done to her in a town square in front of 15 men. All of it written down in a government record available to anyone who cared to read it. "Good," she said. "Let it be public. Let everyone know what Harold Dawson did and who helped him do it." Hart looked at her for a moment, with something that was, she thought, close to respect. "I'll prepare the forms," he said, and went to his filing cabinet. Ethan's hand found hers under the edge of the desk, brief and warm, and there just for a moment, just long enough to say, "I'm here. I'm with you," without saying it in words. She didn't pull away. The sworn statement took 2 hours to complete. Hart asked the questions, and she answered them precisely without embellishment and without minimizing, and a court reporter wrote every word in the careful shorthand of a man whose job was to make truth permanent. Ethan waited in the outer office. She'd asked him to, not because she didn't want him there, but because she needed to say Harold Dawson's name and Rose Walker's name, and the names of what had been done in a town square on a Tuesday morning, without the complication of watching someone who cared about her absorb it in real time. She needed to be alone with the facts long enough to state them cleanly. When she came out, she was very composed, and she was also very tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Ethan looked at her once carefully and said nothing. He simply stood up, and they walked out of Hart's office together into the Tucson afternoon, and they walked the 4 blocks back to the hotel in the same focused silence they'd started the day with, and when they reached the door, he held it open for her, and she went in. "I need an hour," she said in the lobby. "Take whatever you need," he said. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed and put her face in her hands, not crying, just pressing the heels of her palms against her eyes, and breathing the way you breathe when you've been holding yourself very precisely together for a very long time, and the immediate requirement for precision has momentarily passed. She thought about her mother. She thought Margaret Dawson. Your husband sold your daughter in the town square, and it turns out he'd been set up to do it by a network of lawyers and creditors and a cattleman who wanted a water source. She thought about how that would have landed on Margaret, the grief of it, the rage of it. But also underneath both of those, the woman who'd taught Clara to read and to do sums and to think past the surface of things, the woman who'd said whatever they take from you, they cannot take what you know. Make sure you always know enough. She'd known enough. It had taken 2 days in a hotel room in Tucson, but she'd known enough. She washed her face, straightened her dress, and went back downstairs. Ethan was in the lobby with 2 cups of coffee from the hotel's small dining room. He handed her one without comment. She took it and sat across from him at one of the small tables by the window, and they drank their coffee and let the day settle around them. "I need to tell you something," Ethan said. She looked at him. "When I came to Redstone," he said, "when I heard about the auction and decided to intervene, part of what I told myself was that I was doing it for Rose, for what happened to her, that I was correcting something, making a different outcome." He looked at his coffee cup. "I've been honest with you about a great deal, and I want to be honest about this too. I wasn't entirely selfless. I was carrying 4 years of guilt about Rose, and the auction was a place to put it, a way to do something." He looked up. "You deserve to know that." Clara regarded him for a moment. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, "that you did a good thing for a complicated reason, and you want credit for the complication?" He blinked. "I know. I want you to have the full picture, so you can—" "Ethan," she set down her coffee cup. "Everybody who does a good thing does it for complicated reasons. That's what makes people people, and not mechanisms." She looked at him steadily. "What you did at that auction was real regardless of what was driving it. What you've done since is real. The complicated reasons don't cancel the action." She paused. "I grew up with a man who did bad things and told himself the reasons made them something other than bad. You are the opposite problem. You're doing good things and trying to make them smaller than they are." She picked up her coffee again. "Stop it." He was quiet for a moment. "You're very hard to apologize to," he said. "You don't have anything to apologize for," she said. "That's why." Something happened in his face. The thing she'd stopped trying to name just felt now when it happened, the opening of a room getting more light. He looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away this time, and the coffee cooled in their cups. "After this is done," Ethan said. "After the hearing and Fitch and all of it, what do you want, Clara? What do you actually want for yourself?" No one had asked her that. Not with that word, want. Not as a serious question, not as an invitation. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything. "I want to keep doing the accounts," she said. "I'm good at it, and it matters, and I find it satisfying. The problem-solving of it." She paused. "I want to write to Rose, if she's willing. I think we might have things to say to each other that would be useful to both of us." He nodded carefully. "I think she'd want that too." "I want to not go back to Harold Dawson's house," Clara said. "Ever. For any reason." "That's not going to be a problem," Ethan said with a flatness that was not quite humor and not quite a promise and was somehow both. "And I want—" She stopped. She thought about the dream she'd had in Tucson, the first night, the kitchen in the morning, the smell of coffee, the ordinary life of the ranch. "I want to see what Bar W looks like in a year," she said. "When all of this is resolved, and the spring is secure, and Maddox has been dealt with, and the ledgers are clean. I want to see what it looks like then." "It looks like home," Ethan said quietly. "That's what it looks like." She met his eyes. He held them. The lobby of the Tucson hotel was very ordinary around them. A clerk behind the desk, the sound of the street outside, a grandfather clock against the far wall, and in the middle of all that ordinary, something named itself finally between them. Not spoken, but named. She didn't look away. "We should get back," she said. "Tomorrow is going to be complicated." "Yes," he agreed. But neither of them moved for another moment. Dawn. The return to Redstone was 2 days, and they arrived to find that the world had not waited quietly in their absence. Tommy met them at the gate with the expression of a young man carrying news he doesn't want to deliver. "Boss," he said, "there was a man here yesterday. Said he was from Fitch's office. Said he had papers to serve." Ethan swung down from his horse. "What kind of papers?" "Cal wouldn't let him in," Tommy said. "Said he needed to see identification and authorization, and the man didn't have it right. Cal made him leave." A pause. "Cal said to tell you he's pretty sure the man wrote down the property boundaries before he left, though. Walked the fence line." "He was assessing the property," Clara said. Tommy looked at her. "That's what Cal thought, too." "Good man, Cal," Ethan said. He looked at Clara. "They know we've been to Tucson. Fitch will know by now that a counter-motion has been filed," Clara said. "Hart filed it yesterday morning. The hearing is in 11 days. She paused. "They're accelerating." "What does that mean?" Tommy asked. "It means things are going to move faster than expected," Clara said. "And it means everyone on this property needs to be careful." She looked at Tommy directly at his young face and his direct gaze, and the fact that his handwriting was cramped and effortful and had nothing to do with the neat signatures on the fraudulent invoices. "Tommy, I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "Yes, ma'am," he said immediately. "In the past year, has anyone asked you to help with the ranch's paperwork? Filing invoices, recording deliveries, anything like that?" "Someone outside the ranch, not Ethan, not Cal." Tommy frowned. "There was a man came by in the spring. Said he was from Fitch's office. Said Ethan had asked him to collect some supply receipts for the year-end accounts." He paused. "I gave him copies. Ethan was up north with the herd. I thought he said Ethan had asked." "It's all right," Clara said, keeping her voice level. "You weren't wrong to trust someone who said they were from the ranch's lawyer. That's a reasonable thing to trust." "Was he not?" Tommy stopped. Read something in her expression. "He wasn't from Fitch's office." "He was from Fitch's office," Clara said. "He just wasn't there for the reason he said." Tommy's face did something complicated, the look of a young man understanding that he'd been used as a tool against someone he was loyal to. "Boss," he said. "I'm sorry, I didn't—" "You didn't do anything wrong," Ethan said firmly. "Somebody lied to you. That's their fault, not yours." "But if I hadn't given him the receipts, he'd have found another way," Clara said. "He's been at this for 4 years. You were one of many steps, Tommy, not the important one." She held his gaze until she saw him believe it at least partially. "What's important now is what we do in the next 11 days. Tommy straightened. He was young and earnest and had been used without knowing it, and those were not small things, but they were also not things that couldn't be carried. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need you to be where I can find you when I have questions about operations," Clara said. "You've been here 6 years. You know things about the day-to-day that I don't know yet, and the lawyers in Tucson definitely don't know. That knowledge matters for what's coming." He nodded, twice firmly. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at Ethan. He gave her the small nod that had become their shorthand, the one that meant, "I see it. I agree. Keep going." She went into the house. The next 8 days had the quality of siege, not dramatic, not visible from the outside, but constant and pressured and requiring everything she had to sustain. Clara worked the ledgers by day and the legal documents by night, cross-referencing Hart's filings against what she knew, sending letters to Tucson with questions and receiving answers by return post that she then folded into the next set of questions. She wrote to Aldridge twice. He wrote back once tersely with one additional detail that she immediately forwarded to Hart, the name of the bank account the fraudulent invoice over charges had been deposited into. A Tucson bank. A name on the account she didn't recognize. She wrote back to Hart. "Who is this name?" Hart's answer arrived 4 days before the hearing and contained only Thomas A. Crane, attorney at law. The same name from the brass plate on Fitch's building, which closed the last link in the chain, The money from Bar W's fraudulent invoices had gone directly into a bank account belonging to Thomas Crane, Vic Crane's brother, the well-dressed man she'd watched walk out of Fitch's office in Tucson, the lawyer whose family connection to Redstone's biggest creditor had put Harold Dawson in a desperate enough position to stand on an auction platform and wait for the numbers to add up right. She sat with that document for a long time. Then she did what she always did. When she had a complete picture, she organized it in the evidentiary order, the order that built the clearest case, and she went to find Ethan. He was in the barn. She didn't announce herself. She just came in and stood until he turned around, and when he saw her face, he came to her directly and took the papers she was holding. He read them. He read them again. "It's complete," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "The full chain. Crane to Fitch to Aldridge to the fraudulent invoices to the overcharges to the modified water rights clause to the petition." She paused. "And Vic Crane to Harold Dawson to the auction. Both chains, connected at Thomas Crane." "One family," Ethan said. "Greed is usually a family business," Clara said. "One of them had the legal knowledge. One of them had the local network. One of them had the muscle. And Harold—" She stopped. Harold was the easiest part of it. A man in debt without principles, with a daughter who could be used as a disruption at the critical moment. She said it factually because it was a fact, because she had long since decided that the facts of Harold Dawson's character were not things she would soften for the sake of her own feelings about them. They found him and they used him, and it was not difficult. "Clara," Ethan's voice was careful. "I'm not broken by it," she said. "I know what he is. I've known for years. Knowing the scale of it is—" She paused. "Bigger than I expected, but not different in kind." He looked at her for a long moment. "The hearing is in 4 days," he said. "Are we ready?" "Hart is ready," Clara said. "I want to be there." "I assumed you would be." "I want to speak," she said. "If the court allows. I want to give the statement myself, not read by Hart, not summarized. I want to say what I saw and what I did in that land office and what I found in those ledgers in my own words." Ethan held her gaze. "Do you know what that means?" In a territorial court in 1878, a woman speaking. "I know exactly what it means," Clara said. "It means they'll look at me differently than they'd look at a man saying the same things. It means some of them won't want to hear it." She felt something settle in her chest, certain and quiet. "It also means they can't say they don't understand it. When I say it, it comes from someone who is in the middle of it, someone they can see, someone real." She paused. "I am not going to be invisible about this, Ethan. Not anymore." He looked at her, this man who had bought her freedom without being asked to, who had given her room to work and room to breathe, and room to be exactly who she was, who had told her the truth about his complicated reasons and accepted her accounting of them without argument. "No," he said softly. "You're not." He handed her back the papers. His hand stayed on hers for a moment, not brief this time, not the passing touch of support. Just his hand warm and certain over hers. She looked down at their hands. She looked up at his face. "Ethan," she said. "After the hearing." "Yes," he said. "We need to talk about—" She stopped because the words for what she meant were large, and she was, despite everything, someone who was careful with large words. "I know," he said. "After the hearing." She nodded. She folded the papers against her chest and went back to the house and spent the last 3 hours of daylight writing the statement she intended to give in the clearest language she knew, in the voice that was entirely and unmistakably hers. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark of her small room and listened to Bar W settle the horses, the night animals, the bunkhouse quiet, and she thought about the morning, about a courtroom in Tucson, about saying Harold Dawson's name in front of a judge and meaning every syllable, about Ethan beside her in the public gallery, About 4 years of patient methodical cruelty being dismantled by a woman who had learned to read numbers in her father's ledger and had never once been told she was supposed to. She thought about the kitchen in the morning, the smell of coffee, Cal's dry commentary and Tommy's enormous appetite, and Hector's peppers that he'd offered within a week, just as Ethan had predicted. The way the ranch had slowly in 2 weeks begun to feel like the thing she'd dreamed about the first night in Tucson. She thought, I have never had anything I didn't want to lose. She thought, I have never had anything worth losing before. She got up, lit the lamp, and read through her statement one final time. It was good. It was precise and clear and complete, and it said every true thing without flinching from any of it. And she was going to stand in a territorial courtroom and say it out loud. She blew out the lamp. She lay in the dark. She thought, whatever happens tomorrow, I am already not the girl who stood on that platform. I am already somewhere that girl couldn't have imagined. Whatever comes next is built on that. The territorial courthouse in Tucson opened its doors at 9 o'clock, and by 8:45, every seat in the public gallery was filled. Clara had not expected that. She'd understood the case was significant. A water rights dispute with fraud attached always drew attention in ranching territory, but the gallery was standing room, and she could feel the quality of the attention in the room before she'd even taken her seat. This was not casual curiosity. These were ranchers, landowners, men with their own filed claims, and their own lawyers, and their own anxiety about what a territorial court could do to property they'd spent years building. A case that exposed a lawyer for engineering fraudulent clause modifications was not just one man's problem. It was everyone's problem. Every man in that gallery was wondering if Gerald Fitch had touched their paperwork. Ethan sat beside her at the plaintiff's table. He was composed in the way she'd come to understand meant he was carrying something significant and had made the decision not to let it show. His hands were flat on the table in front of him. He'd dressed carefully, not formally, but with the quiet intention of a man who understood that how you presented yourself in a courtroom told the court something about whether you took it seriously. Samuel Hart sat on Ethan's other side, his files organized in the evidentiary order Clara had suggested, which he'd adopted without comment, and which she considered one of the better professional compliments she'd received. Across the aisle, Gerald Fitch sat with his own attorney. He'd had the sense not to represent himself a younger man, with the tight jaw of someone managing a difficult brief. Fitch was 60, silver-haired, with the practiced presentation of a man who'd spent decades being trusted. He looked calm. Clara assessed his calm and concluded it was performance because no man whose fraud had been documented as thoroughly as his was calm on the inside. Thomas Crane was not in the courtroom. Clara noted his absence and filed it. Cray Maddox was in the gallery third row, thick-bearded and watchful. She noted him too. The judge entered. The room stood. The room sat. The proceedings began. Hart opened with the counter-motion laying the legal framework in the precise, unhurried manner of a man who knew his case was solid and had no need to oversell it. He explained the original territorial statute on water rights. He explained the language Fitch had filed in Bar W's documentation. He put both texts before the court and let the modification speak for itself. The judge read both passages. He read them again. He looked at Fitch's attorney. "Counselor," he said, "do you dispute that the language in the Bar W filing differs from the statutory language?" Fitch's attorney stood. "Your Honor, the language is an interpretation of the statute, not a modification. Legal documents." "Counselor," the judge said, "the statute says complete abandonment. The filing says failure to maintain continuous beneficial use. Those are not the same phrase. Your Honor, the intent." "The intent," the judge said, "is exactly what we're here to determine." He set the papers down. "Continue, Mr. Hart." Hart continued. He presented Aldridge's ledger entries. He presented the authorization signatures. He presented the bank records, Thomas Crane's account, the deposit amounts that matched the overcharges on Bar W's fraudulent invoices precisely. He laid it out in the order Clara had organized it, each piece building on the last, and the courtroom was very quiet. In the way courtrooms go quiet when evidence is being presented that everyone in the room understands the weight of. When Hart sat down, Fitch's attorney rose for cross-examination and spent 20 minutes trying to introduce doubt about the handwriting comparisons, the signature identifications, the chain of authorization. He was not incompetent. He made several arguments that required Hart to work. But the evidence was what it was, and Clara had been thorough, and thorough is difficult to argue with. Then Hart said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness." The judge looked at his list. Miss Clara Dawson. Clara stood. She heard the gallery shift the collective involuntary adjustment of a room, recalibrating its expectations. She walked to the witness stand with her back straight and her pace even and her hand still, and she sat and she looked at the judge directly. "Miss Dawson," Hart said, "please tell the court how you came to examine the financial records of Bar W Ranch." She told them. She told it in the precise, clear chronological order she'd written the night before, and she told it in her own voice, not the careful social voice she used at the ranch table, not the pleasant professional voice she'd used with Aldridge and the land office clerk, but the voice underneath all of those, the one that had no performance in it, the one that was simply true. She described the ledgers and what she'd found in them. She described the journey to Tucson and what she'd found in the land office. She described Aldridge's ledger and the authorization signatures and the bank account name. She described standing across the street from Fitch's building and watching Thomas Crane speak to Cray Maddox with the ease of men who have met in that way before. She described the auction. She said it plainly, not with drama, not with the kind of emotional performance that courts sometimes discounted as unreliable. She said it as fact, which it was on the 12th of September, 1878, in the town square of Redstone, Arizona Territory. She had stood on a platform and been offered for sale by her father, and the sequence of events that had led to that morning was connected through Vic Crane, through Thomas Crane, through Gerald Fitch, to a coordinated effort to destabilize Bar W Ranch and force a below-market sale. The room was absolutely still. Fitch's attorney rose for cross-examination. He was careful. He did not go after her character directly. He was smart enough to know that attacking a woman on a witness stand about an auction she hadn't chosen would not play well in a room full of men who had daughters. Instead, he tried to challenge her methodology, her qualifications, her right to interpret financial documents without professional credentials. "Miss Dawson," he said, with the smooth patience of a man who believed condescension was a legal strategy. "You describe yourself as a ranch housekeeper. Is that correct?" "Yes," Clara said. "No formal training in accounting. No legal education. No formal training," Clara said. "I'm self-taught." "And yet you claim to have identified a complex legal fraud that eluded the notice of trained professionals for 4 years." Clara looked at him steadily. "I identified a pattern of numbers that didn't add up," she said. "I don't think that required formal training. I think it required looking." She paused one beat. "Someone should have looked sooner. I agree with you on that." A sound moved through the gallery. Not laughter, something more restrained the sound of people recognizing a fair hit. Fitch's attorney moved on quickly. He asked her about her father. He asked about the auction in the careful, oblique way of someone trying to suggest that her testimony might be motivated by a desire for personal vindication. Clara answered every question directly and without defensiveness, because defensiveness was what he was fishing for, and she had not come to this courtroom to give him what he was fishing for. "Miss Dawson," he said finally, "you have significant personal grievances connected to these events. Isn't it possible that your interpretation of the financial records was colored by those grievances?" Clara looked at him for a moment. "The numbers are what they are," she said. "My feelings about my father don't change what was deposited into Thomas Crane's bank account." She paused. "You're welcome to check the arithmetic yourself, counselor. I've provided all the documentation. The arithmetic doesn't care about my personal feelings." The gallery made the sound again. Fitch's attorney sat down. Hart had one redirect question. "Miss Dawson, in your examination of Bar W Ranch's financial records, did you find any evidence that Mr. Ethan Walker was aware of or participated in the fraudulent invoicing scheme?" "None whatsoever," Clara said. "The evidence indicates he was the target of it, not a party to it." "Thank you," Hart said. No further questions. Clara stepped down from the witness stand and walked back to the plaintiff's table and sat. And Ethan's hand found hers under the table's edge and held it, and she let him because she was past the kind of pride that refused to be steadied by someone who cared. The judge called a recess of 40 minutes. Clara spent most of it in the courthouse hallway, standing by a window, letting the sustained tension of the last hour work its way through her system. Ethan stood nearby. They didn't talk much. They'd said most of what needed to be said. Hart came to find them 15 minutes into the recess with a look Clara had learned to read, the look of a man with new information. Crane has been located, he said quietly. Thomas Crane. He was at the train station this morning with 2 bags. The territorial marshal's office picked him up 20 minutes ago. Clara felt something in her chest release that she hadn't known was held. He was running. He was running, Hart confirmed, which from an evidentiary standpoint is extremely useful. He paused. It also means he's facing arrest, which means he will very shortly become interested in cooperation. Men facing criminal charges in this territory tend to find their memories improving considerably when someone offers them a shorter sentence for testimony. He'll give up Fitch, Ethan said. He'll give up everyone he can think of, Hart said, including, I expect, Maddox, and... He paused with the careful hesitation of someone about to say something they know will land hard. Possibly your father, Miss Dawson. If Harold Dawson knowingly participated in the scheme beyond simply being a man in debt who made a terrible decision. He knew enough, Clara said. I don't know how much, but he knew something. She said it flat and clear because it was true, and because she had decided in the courthouse hallway to be done with protecting Harold Dawson from the consequences of Harold Dawson's choices. Whatever he knew, it should come out. Hart nodded. All right. He went back inside. Ethan looked at her. Are you? I'm fine, she said. I've been fine about my father for a long time. What I'm still deciding is what fine looks like going forward. She looked at the window. He's going to face something now. Legal consequences, social consequences. In Redstone, when this story gets out, and it will get out, he will not be able to walk down the street the same way. She paused. Part of me feels exactly what you'd expect, and part of me just feels done, like the chapter closed and the next one is starting. Which part is bigger? Ethan asked. She thought about it honestly. The done part, she said. By a significant amount. He nodded and said nothing more because he understood that this was not the moment for commentary. He just stood beside her at the window until the recess bell rang, and then they went back inside together. The judge delivered his preliminary ruling 40 minutes after the recess. He found on the basis of the presented evidence that the language in Bar W. Ranch's water rights filing had been materially modified from the governing territorial statute in a manner that created artificial legal vulnerability for the property owner. He found that the petition for reassessment filed by Cray Maddox was therefore based on a fraudulent legal instrument and was dismissed with prejudice. He referred the matter of Gerald Fitch's conduct to the Territorial Bar Association for immediate disbarment proceedings. He issued a bench referral to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office regarding Thomas Crane and the coordinated financial fraud, noting that the evidence before him was sufficient to support criminal charges. He did not rule on Maddox directly. Maddox's legal exposure was a matter for the criminal proceedings, but he noted for the record that the petition filed on Maddox's behalf had been prepared by a lawyer now under disbarment proceedings using a fraudulent instrument that lawyer had himself created, and that the court took a dim view of legal processes being used as instruments of property theft. Gerald Fitch sat through all of it with the careful stillness of a man who had decided that stillness was the last thing he had left to control. His attorney was already gathering papers with the efficient haste of someone planning his next several conversations. In the gallery, Cray Maddox stood up before the judge had finished speaking. He walked out without looking at anyone, which was either confidence or retreat. Clara suspected retreat, and the sound of his boots on the courthouse floor was the last she heard of him that day. She thought, he's not done. Men like that don't accept outcomes they didn't choose. But he's damaged now, legally exposed, publicly connected to a fraud, his petition dismissed, and his lawyer disbarred. He would need to recalculate, and recalculation takes time, and time was something she and Ethan now had. The judge finished. The room stood. He left. The noise of the gallery released like a breath held for too long. Voices, movement, the particular energy of a crowd that has witnessed something significant and needs to say so. Hart turned to them with the satisfied expression of a man who'd expected to win and had. "Well," he said, "that went as it should." "It went better," Ethan said. "Because of the preparation." Hart looked at Clara. "I want to repeat what I said in my office," he said. "I've been practicing territorial law for 31 years. What you did with those documents, the organization, the analysis, the witness testimony, was as competent as anything I've seen from trained legal professionals." He paused. "If you're ever interested in formal legal study, Miss Dawson, I would be glad to write whatever letters would be useful." Clara looked at him. She hadn't expected that, not from this man in this courthouse on this day. She felt the weight of it, the unexpected generosity of being seen correctly by someone who had no reason to see her as anything other than a ranch housekeeper who'd stumbled into useful information. "Thank you," she said. "I'll think about it seriously." "Do," he said, and gathered his files and went to speak to the court clerk. Ethan was looking at her. She could feel it. "A lawyer," he said. "He said I'd be good at it." "He's right," Ethan said. "I've known that since you put those invoices in evidentiary order." He paused. "What do you think?" Clara thought about it. Really thought about it the way she thought about serious things from the inside out. Legal study. The formal version of what she'd been doing her whole life, reading, arguing, making the case. Access to the tools she'd been using in homemade versions since she was 14. "I think," she said slowly, "that it's something worth considering, after things settle." She looked at him. "After we deal with what still needs dealing with." "Harold," he said. "Harold," she agreed. "Yeah." They rode back towards Redstone the next morning. The long road through the desert. The red rock and the pale sky. The rhythm of horses that had become, over these weeks, a familiar comfort, rather than an unfamiliar one. They were 2 hours out of Tucson when Ethan pulled his horse up, and Clara pulled hers up beside him, because she felt the intention in the stop. He looked at her. "I said after the hearing," he said. "This is after the hearing." Clara waited. "I need to tell you something," Ethan said, "and I want to say it out here, where there's room to say it, without the walls of a room making it smaller than it is." He looked at the horizon, then back at her. "I came to Redstone for Rose. That's true. And I came with anger. That's true too. And when I saw you on that platform, something happened that I didn't expect and didn't plan for, and have spent 3 weeks trying to—" He stopped. "I'm not good at this," he said. "You're doing fine," Clara said quietly. "I love you," he said. That's the simple version. Everything else I was trying to say is the complicated version of that. The desert was enormous, and still around them. A hawk moved somewhere in the high air above. Clara looked at Ethan Walker, this quiet, scarred, principled man who had arrived at an auction with anger in his heart and had chosen at the critical moment something better than anger. Who had given her options when no one had ever given her options. Who had listened to her think out loud and never once tried to make himself the more important voice in the room. Who had told her the complicated truth about his reasons and accepted her accounting of them without argument. Who had held her hand under a courtroom table and not let go. "I know," she said. "I love you too." She said it the same way she said everything that mattered, plainly looking at him directly, without making it smaller than it was. "I've known for a while. I was waiting for you to catch up." Something happened in his face that she'd never seen before. Not the opening of a room getting more light, but the room itself fully lit, the whole thing visible at once. He laughed, brief and genuine, and unprepared for the laugh of a man who has been holding something tight for so long that releasing it is physically funny. "You were waiting for me," he said. "You're very thorough," she said. "I appreciated that you wanted to be sure." He shook his head, still almost smiling the real smile, the one she'd been collecting since the hotel dining room in Redstone. "Clara Dawson," he said. "Ethan Walker," she said back. They rode on. Two horses side by side this time, not him slightly ahead, not her keeping careful distance, but side by side, the same pace, the same road. Harold Dawson's accounting came 2 weeks later. The Territorial Prosecutor's Office sent a deputy to Redstone based on Thomas Crane's cooperation. Crane had given them everything as Hart had predicted, with the thoroughness of a man purchasing his own shorter sentence. Harold Dawson had known it emerged, not the full extent of the scheme, but enough. He'd known that Vic Crane's debt was connected to his brother Thomas's legal operations. He'd known that selling Clara would clear not just the debt, but create a favorable circumstance for a larger transaction. He'd been told in the careful language of men who maintain deniability that his cooperation would be remembered. He hadn't known it was fraud. Or he'd told himself he hadn't known the distinction Clara reflected between what Harold Dawson knew and what Harold Dawson allowed himself to know had always been somewhat flexible. He was not charged criminally. The prosecutor determined that his knowing was not specific enough to support criminal conspiracy charges. But he was named in the civil proceedings publicly in documents that would be part of the territorial record. His connection to Vic Crane, to Thomas Crane, to the scheme that had attempted to strip Bar W Ranch from its owner, all of it was on paper in a government ledger permanent. In Redstone, the story moved the way stories move in small towns, completely immediately, and with significant embellishment. The embellishment didn't matter much. The true version was damning enough. Clara heard about it from Mrs. Fraley, who wrote her a letter they had developed since that first morning in the general store, a correspondence that was efficient and practical, and had the warm edges of mutual respect. Mrs. Fraley's letter said, "Your father is not well received in town at present. He has tried twice to sit at the Silver Spur and been asked to leave. I think he is beginning to understand the nature of his situation. I thought you should know." Clara read the letter twice. She thought about what she felt. She felt mostly that the chapter had closed. Not justice exactly. Harold Dawson was not in prison. He was not suffering in any dramatic way. He was simply a man who had done a terrible thing, and was now known to have done it, which was the kind of consequence that was neither satisfying nor insufficient, but simply real. She wrote back to Mrs. Fraley, "Thank you for telling me. I am well. The ranch is well. I don't think I'll be returning to Redstone often, but when I do, I hope we can have coffee." Mrs. Fraley wrote back the same week, "I'll put the good coffee on." She wrote to Rose Walker in October. She'd thought about what to say for a long time, not what information to convey, because information was easy, but what tone, what register. She didn't want to write as someone who needed to be absolved of her father's sins, because Rose didn't owe her absolution, and she didn't need it. She didn't want to write as someone claiming kinship through shared injury, because shared injury was real, but it wasn't the whole of either of them. She wrote as herself. She told Rose she was living at Bar W Ranch and managing the household and the accounts, and that she'd followed the Tucson proceedings with satisfaction, and that she was sorry for what Harold Dawson had done and understood if Rose had no desire to correspond. She said she'd heard Rose was learning French and that she herself had been reading Blackstone from a battered copy that had belonged to her mother's father, and that she thought the law was a more interesting subject than it was usually given credit for. She said, "I think we might have things to say to each other that would be useful to both of us, but only if you want to. There is no obligation." Rose's letter arrived 3 weeks later. It was long. It was careful at first, the careful length of someone who'd learned to test the temperature of a situation before committing fully, and then by the third page, it was something else. It was Rose Walker writing without the careful guard writing the way Clara suspected she wrote when she wasn't being polite. Quick and direct, and with a dry humor that reminded Clara unexpectedly and sharply of her own best voice. Rose had read Blackstone too. She found it, she wrote, clearer than most legal men she'd encountered in person, which she acknowledged was damning with faint praise. Clara laughed out loud at that alone in the kitchen on a November morning, and the sound of it surprised her, not the laugh itself, but the ease of it. The uncomplicated delight of recognizing someone across a letter. She wrote back the same day. Cray Maddox made one more attempt. In November, 6 weeks after the Tucson hearing, 2 of Bar W's eastern fence posts were found cut, not weathered, not damaged, but cut deliberately at the base. The wire had been rolled back in a way that allowed cattle to drift through. 40 head wandered onto Maddox's land before Tommy found the gap. Clara heard about it at supper from Tommy, who was angrier than she'd seen him, which was saying something because Tommy's anger ran hot and fast. "I'll ride out tomorrow and fix it," he said. "But boss," "I know," Ethan said. "It's Maddox," Tommy said. "Has to be." "Yes," Ethan said. "It is." "Then what do we document it," Clara said from her end of the table. Everyone looked at her. "We document the cut posts, the rolled wire, the date, the number of cattle that wandered. We photograph it if we can, and if we can't, we get 2 witnesses to sign a written account." She looked at Ethan. "And then we send that documentation to Hart, and Hart adds it to the civil case file. And every time Maddox does something like this, it costs him more in the eventual judgment." She paused. "He's not going to stop. Men like him don't stop when they lose, they just change tactics. But every tactic he tries becomes evidence. We collect the evidence, and we let the law do what the law is for." Tommy looked at Ethan. "She's right," Cal said from the far end of the table. It was the second time he'd volunteered an opinion at supper in 2 months, which in Cal terms constituted enthusiastic endorsement. Ethan looked at Clara with the expression she'd stopped trying to name and had simply started accepting as a fact of her life the way the desert was a fact, or the cold mornings were a fact, or the smell of coffee at 6 a.m. was a fact. "Document it," he said. "Tommy, you and Clara ride out first thing." "Yes, boss," Tommy said. They documented it. They sent it to Hart. Hart added it to the file. Maddox tried twice more over the winter. A challenge to a water usage permit filed through a different lawyer who turned out to be a cousin of Thomas Crane and was therefore already on Hart's radar. And an approach to one of Bar W's cattle buyers attempting to undercut the ranch's contract price. Both attempts were documented. Both were handled. Neither worked. By spring, Maddox had stopped. Whether he'd run out of tactics, or run out of money, or simply run out of the particular energy that sustained long campaigns against people who kept winning, Clara didn't know. She didn't spend much time wondering. She had other things to think about. Ethan asked her to marry him on an evening in March on the porch steps, where they'd first sat together 6 months before, which she thought was either very intentional or very Ethan, probably both. Since with Ethan Walker, intention and character were usually the same thing. He didn't make a speech. He said, "I want to do this right. I want to ask you properly, and I want you to have time to think, and I want—" He stopped. "I want you to know that whatever you say, you have a home here. That part isn't connected to this question." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Ethan," she said, "I've been thinking about it since October." A pause. And yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He looked at her with the fully lit room expression, and she looked back with the expression she knew she had, the one she didn't have a name for either, but that felt from the inside like the first morning of something that was going to last. "Obviously," he repeated. "You're a thorough man," she said. "I assumed you'd get here eventually." He laughed, the real laugh, warm and unguarded, and she let herself lean against him in the March evening, and the ranch was quiet around them, and the spring ran cold and clear in the northeast corner of their land. Their land. They were married in April, in Redstone, in front of a judge with Mrs. Fraley and Cal and Tommy as witnesses. Rose sent a letter that arrived the day before, and that Clara read aloud at the small supper they held afterward at the ranch, a letter that was funny and warm and ended with, I would like to come and meet her in person if that's still acceptable. I believe I've been corresponding with someone remarkable, and I want to verify it for myself. Ethan said, invite her for summer. Clara wrote back that night. Come in June. Stay as long as you like. There is room, and there is always coffee. And I think you are also somewhat remarkable based on available evidence. Rose came in June. She stayed 3 months. She and Clara spent long evenings at the kitchen table long after the men had gone to their rest, talking about law and language, and the specific texture of surviving something that shouldn't have happened, and building yourself forward from it anyway. Rose was 20 years old, slight and quick-minded, with Ethan's gray eyes, and none of his stillness. She was all motion, all thought, ideas arriving faster than her words could carry them. Clara loved her immediately, the way you love someone who is made of material you recognize. By August, Rose was talking about the law school that had opened in Santa Fe, whether women were permitted, which they were conditionally, whether she had the preparation, which she did more than, whether it was possible. Is it what you want? Clara asked. More than anything, Rose said. But I don't know if I'm ready. After everything. Clara looked at her across the kitchen table on a warm August evening. This 20-year-old girl who had survived Harold Dawson and 2 years of recovery and the long road back to herself, who was learning French and reading Blackstone and corresponding with a lawyer in Tucson who had described her letters as among the most analytically impressive he'd received from anyone in years. Rose, Clara said, ready is not a feeling, ready is a decision. Rose looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once firmly, the nod of someone making a decision they're going to keep. All right, she said, then I'm ready. She enrolled in September. The years settled at Bar W Ranch with the particular quality of time that belongs to places where real life is being lived. Not the dramatic time of crises and resolutions, but the deepening time of ordinary days that accumulate into something solid and lasting. Clara did not go to law school herself. She considered it for a full year, seriously carefully the way she considered everything serious, and concluded that what she wanted was not the formal credential, but the work. Hart corresponded with her regularly. He sent her cases to review questions to analyze briefs to read for structural flaws. She sent back analyses that he increasingly described in letters to colleagues as indispensable. It was not a conventional arrangement. It was hers, which she had come to understand was the same thing as it being right. She kept the accounts. She kept them with the same precise care she'd brought to them from the beginning, and Bar W Ranch flourished in the way businesses flourish when they're managed by someone who understands both the numbers and the humans those numbers represent. The herd expanded. The operation grew. Cal finally said at a supper table he'd been eating at for 9 years that he supposed the ranch was doing all right, which everyone understood was a standing ovation. Tommy learned bookkeeping from Clara. He was not naturally good at it, and he applied himself with a grim determination that she found both endearing and effective. By his 2nd year, he could keep a subsidiary ledger without assistance, which was more than most men in the territory could say. Hector's garden expanded to cover most of the south wall of the house, and he grew peppers that Clara incorporated into a chili that became locally known. People in Redstone mentioned it with a reverence that she found amusing, and Ethan found entirely appropriate. The northeast spring ran clear and cold through every drought year that followed through every hard summer and every uncertain fall, steady as the land itself, uncontested and undisturbed. Harold Dawson left Redstone in the winter of 1879. Mrs. Fraley's letter said he'd gone East Kansas, someone thought. She said, I thought you should know in case you wanted to locate him. I thought you might want to know he is gone. Clara read the letter and sat with it for a long time. She thought about whether she wanted to locate him. She thought about the man who had not looked at her when he drove away from the auction. She thought about Rose Walker at 17, and the 14 months and all the years before that of small daily failures, the bottle, the cards, the debts, the indifference accumulating into the final and definitive failure of a September morning. She wrote back to Mrs. Fraley. Thank you. I don't think I need to know where he is. I know where I am, and that's enough. It was. Their first child was born in the spring of 1880, a daughter delivered by the doctor. Ethan had ridden 12 miles in the dark to bring and held by Clara in the first light of an April morning, with the particular disbelief of a woman who has wanted something so large for so long, that its actual arrival doesn't fit the size of the feeling she'd prepared for. Ethan sat beside her with the expression she'd been watching him wear for 2 years. The fully lit room, the everything visible, and held both their hands, his wife's and his daughter's, and didn't say anything for a long time. "Well," he said finally. "Well," Clara agreed. "She has your chin," he said. "She has your eyes," Clara said. "That seems fair," Ethan said. "Between the two of us, we have enough of both." The baby opened her gray eyes and looked at nothing in particular with the ancient knowing expression of the very newly born, and Clara thought, "You are going to have choices. That is the first thing I am going to give you, before anything else choices." They named her Margaret for Clara's mother. Rose sent a letter from Santa Fe. She was in her second year of law school by then, doing her professor's said extraordinary work that said, "I am entirely undone by this news. Please tell Margaret she has an aunt who fully intends to be an educational influence and a somewhat chaotic presence in her life, and that I am practicing French specifically so I can teach it to her when she's old enough." Ethan read the letter aloud at supper, and Cal smiled. Actually smiled, a real one, briefly visible before he assembled his expression back into its customary composure. More children came in time. 2 sons, a second daughter. The house that had been silent and functional when Clara arrived became something else entirely loud, with meals and arguments and laughter and small disasters, and the ordinary magnificent chaos of a family living inside its own life without apology. The account stayed accurate. The spring stayed clear. The land held. And in the evenings, sometimes when the children were in bed and the ranch was settling into its nighttime sounds, Clara and Ethan sat on the porch steps where they'd first sat together and talked about nothing important and everything that was, and the desert spread enormous and still around them, and the stars were the same excessive, generous abundance they'd always been, and the life they'd built together was exactly what it had always been trying to become. Not the life either of them had expected. Not the life either of them had thought they deserved. Better than both. In Redstone, people still talked about the auction the Tuesday morning in September of 1878, when Harold Dawson had put his daughter on a platform, and a quiet cowboy from Bar W Ranch had stepped forward from the back of the crowd and changed everything. The story grew with the years, as stories do, until it was larger than its facts and truer than its details. But the people who knew what actually happened, the 2 people who'd been there, who'd ridden 12 miles northeast together on a September morning not knowing what came next, they didn't need the larger version. They had the real one. And the real one, with all its difficulty and fear and hard-won clarity, and the simple love that had grown in the space that honesty makes the real one, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything they had chosen on every morning they had woken up, and chosen it again in the house they had built together on land that was theirs, and a life that was entirely, completely, finally their own.